Okay, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Live from the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly dungeon muser today. Today we are starting the first in what will hopefully be a series of videos that I'm calling The Seat Behind the Screen. And what this will be is an opportunity for me to have conversations with friends of mine or folks who I don't know, I guess, who have experience as dungeon masters and have a particular perspective that I'm hoping that they can shed some light on. The first of these series, I got my most recent and one of my favorite dungeon masters, my buddy Jared Rascher.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So for today, Jared and I are going to talk about a game that he really loves that I have I've had some difficulty getting into the game, and I've been wanting to have a conversation with Jared about this game for quite a while because I'm hoping that he'll help me understand what's really to enjoy about this game and how to approach prepping it and running it and whatnot. And that game is 7th Sea Second Edition, published by John Wick Presents. So before we launch into the game, we'll talk about what that's about and what the game is about and whatnot. But first, I want to do some introductions for Jared. So Jared, why don't you tell us who you are?
Oh, goodness. I'm nobody. But in a more specific way, I'm nobody that is a data specialist for my local school district. I've been gaming since 1985. There's a really off chance that, if you're into gaming, you may be among the 10 or 15 people that have ever seen my blog. So, that's a thing. I did actual plays. What's that?
I should mention as well, I've got links to Jared's blog, his reviews, and his YouTube channel in the description of this video. So
you are far too kind.
Facing, please feel free to find some really interesting articles and reviews on those.
You are far too kind. But what's been really great, actually one of the first things that I ever did involving YouTube and all of that was Marvel Heroic, which is really funny. I think my feeling on Marvel Heroic when I first read it is kind of your feelings on 7th Sea. Because when I first read Marvel Heroic, I was like, oh man, this is terrible. I could never run this. This is terrible. And then what was really funny, I'm sorry, I'm getting off on the introduction thing, but I mean, it was just this funny thing where when I saw people discussing the rules, it started clicking in my, that's not the way those rules work. And the more I heard other people talking about it, the more I went back and reread them. I was like, I could run this. And it turned into one of my favorite RPGs. Mm. But as by means of introduction, one of the things that I did back then was I ran a bunch of Marvel Heroic games online, which those are on my YouTube channel. And also our actual play of Shadow the Demon Lord, which Kevin was gracious enough to be one of my players in. So those are both on my YouTube channel. I'm not in this same gaming space now, but I was one of the first GMs for Pathfinder Society, and I was actually in on the original guide for the Season 0 guide. I was one of the people that read through that and gave suggestions on what it should and shouldn't do.
So when did that's actually I saw that in your your bio that you sent over too. So how did you get involved with that? Like, were you involved with the playtesting of the?
Basically, I was one of the people that volunteered to for having a pass to go to Gen Con that year in 2008, and I just. Josh Frost, who was running it at the time, just asked for people to volunteer to look over the manuscript. So I was one of them. I'm not saying there's a ton of stuff in there, but there was just a few tweaks here and there that I was in on saying, yeah, maybe you don't word it this way, or maybe, do it this way. But I was really, really involved in that at the beginning when I volunteered there for Pathfinder Society. Not going to do any kind of critique of that one way or the other, but it did feel, Pathfinder Society in 2008 felt a lot more like how Adventurers League feels to me now.
So that's like, what do you mean by that? Like, it's more of a casual environment, or?
Yeah. There was a lot more of we just want some common rules for all of us to play so that we can get together and do an organized play. There wasn't a lot of rulings on this specific rule and this specific book is used this way. For organized play, it has to be interpreted this way. There's a lot more of that now than there was in that first document in 2008.
When it came out in 2008, I actually haven't checked the publication dates for things, but what was out for Pathfinder at that point? Like core book and that's it, or?
Actually, the first draft that we did for the Season 0 was not even first draft. It was SRD.
Wow.
It was really weird trying to work around that, which is why they wanted to have a core rulebook out, because all they could really reference is SRD things, and they're saying this is what you're doing here and this is what you're doing here, and it's actually part of why they had an alternate XP system, because if you look back in the 3.5 SRD, the XP system is not part of the system reference document. So that's part of what motivated them to say, hey, every 3 games that you play, you get a level, because there is no set XP system in the SRD until they had that to go with.
I've never been involved with the any of the organized play before, so I'm this is coming from a place of ignorance here. But were the adventures that they were that you were prepping to run? Is that stuff that linked into their adventure paths, or was it?
It wasn't actually part of the adventure paths. It's very strongly tied into the actual setting, but it really didn't key off of any of the specific adventure paths that were going on one way or the other.
Oh, okay, cool. So, because I guess it's interesting to think of what business reason they had for putting the Emmy, hey. It's beautiful and sunny out. There's tons of people outside flipping out. It's interesting that they put the organized play before the actual rules being out.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting, but it goes back to me and what I think most companies think they want from an organized play, and what they probably should do, which is our organized play is so that we're getting people to notice this game, and we're getting people to run this game a certain way, so that we're putting our best foot forward to show people what this game is about and what you can do with it. Mm-hmm. Which feels to me like what you should do with it. Organized play, it's what I see a lot with my local Adventures League for D&D, where there really are people that have never played D&D before that just wander in, and people can say, hey, that's cool, here's how you make your character, and go ahead and sit down, and here you go. So that's basically it. So by way of introduction, that was a really long introduction there. But finally, I have been absolutely wonderfully blessed that a couple of the people at Gnome Stew noticed my reviews that I was doing on my blog. Chris Sneezak, who also does the Misdirected Mark podcast, and he's also part of Encoded Designs, basically told John, who runs Gnome Stew, John Arcadian, he said, hey, John, what do you think of these reviews? And John said, hey, you want to come write for us? And it's been absolutely amazing. I am bowled over, because Gnome Stew is this thing that's been in existence ever since I kind of got back into the hobby, in a significant manner. I've read it a lot. It's meant a lot to me, and I'm just kind of floored that I'm actually writing for them now. So
cool.
Super long introduction. I'm really sorry about that.
No, so one of the anyone who tunes into my videos knows that it's not brevity is not something that I'm so, however the fuck long it takes is how long it takes. You mentioned you got into gaming in 1985. The games I'm thinking of that are, because we're around the same vintage, and 85 is around Marvel Superheroes and D&D box sets and AD&D, and then maybe Indiana Jones and Top Secret-ish as well. Did you play all those, or?
I started off. I stole my sister's the magenta box set that was before the Beck Me Red box set.
Yep.
I stole that from her because my parents got that for her, because this is some crazy game that everybody's talking about. I want that. And then she didn't do anything with it. And I was like, I want that crazy game. So I stole it out of her room and I read through it. And I did a horrible job running it. I was so terrible at running that one. And actually, in retrospect, I think the next red box was probably a little better teaching set than that one was. But I have that one. That was what got me into it. I ran it. I did a terrible job. Then I watched a friend's brother run a game of AD&D, which, while it's not the same rules, it was like, oh God, that's what that meant. But I think what's really funny is I got into the hobby through D&D, but I really, really loved Marvel Superheroes, and I ran a lot of that once that came out, because I was already a comic book geek at that time. So once I had that, I was like, oh, this is awesome. And to me, it was very easy to make people from the comics in that. When a new character would show up, like in X-Men, I could be like, I'm going to get out my books and, do their stats. And it really wasn't that hard to, reverse engineer that character in that system. So it really excited me.
Did you start with the basic set, the yellow one, or the advanced set?
I had the basic set, but I got the advanced set like right away. I mean, I don't even. I think I might have run like 1 or 2 sessions with the basic set before I got the advanced set.
Yeah, because I'm not sure. I mean, the basic set didn't have a huge selection of characters in it. The advanced set was fucking crazy. Like,
oh yeah.
By comparison of what other games were available out there at the time, it was just bonkers how much stuff you got in that advanced.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And that was the thing I realized. I recently reread it because actually I reread it because I was curious to see what all rules I completely skipped over and forgot about.
Yeah.
So I started rereading it, and it struck me that that is the first RPG that had a conversational tone. And as opposed to, this is a game, you will do this way. You know, you may vary from this point, but it was all very serious and very procedural. And Marvel Superheroes, the way I'm assuming, since Jeff Grubb has the main credit on there, the way Jeff Grubb writes that, it's just like, it is very much in the style of Marvel in that time period. Like, there are jokes, there are sidebars, there's all sorts of stuff that just, it's like, this is a game, we're playing a game about superheroes, we're playing a game about these guys, just chill out. You know, it's very much that tone to it, and I wasn't used to that from role-playing games at that point.
Yeah. When it has a very Marvel sort of feel to it too, because I mean, like Stan Lee's shtick was always very, you know, jokey and inclusive for, you know, like as if you're in on the joke with, you know, so it was appropriate for that material too. I've actually got a friend, the second person I've got lined up for this series of videos, his favorite game, and he's run shit as wide, like there's an Evil Dead influence game that he runs using Marvel superheroes. And we played. A friend of mine had a gaming stag a few years ago. So he had his proper stag in Vegas, but he also had a gaming stag where he invited a bunch of us to run, you know, 4 hours worth of stuff for him. And my buddy ran a Pacific Rim inspired scene where we were all playing Red Ronin.
Oh man, so, I know. Cool. I so want to run a Marvel thing that has Godzilla in it because, you know, technically Godzilla is a Marvel character. They just can't ever name him because they don't have the license anymore, just like ROM. And that was the crazy thing about Marvel too in that time period. It was like they would get a license for something and they didn't do a separate comic. They were in the Marvel universe.
Yeah. Because I mean, they did have, like, they were one of, in comics at least, they were one of the if not the pioneer for the shared universe sort of thing, where something would happen in one and you'd see it referenced in another comic.
Yeah, and I've said this before. DC eventually crossed everyone over, but the way DC crosses people over is sort of like a, you know, hey, let's handshake and have this story, and then go our separate ways back to our own separate cities and have our own separate mythologies. And that's, I honestly think that's part of why you see certain character archetypes repeated in multiple people's rogues galleries. So, like, for example, Trickster and Joker are the same character. They are literally the same character, but they are in both of those things because Flash's world is Central City and Batman's world is Gotham City. So for a long time, there wasn't as much integration of those things. Yeah, Flash and Batman might see each other on the Justice League, but you didn't see Batman going to Central City to fight crime.
Yep.
That is not the way Marvel from the beginning was everybody's in everybody else's business. I mean, that's not even a joke. It's literally like the second issue of Spider-Man where he's running into the Fantastic Four, and you know, early on in the Fantastic Four, Thing fights Hulk for the first time. Now, granted, the fact that Stan Lee was writing 90% of these books probably plays into this, but
and also, I mean, like he was a great always was a great promoter for the books as well too. So I mean, if you're it's the same reason you have crossovers in like TV shows and shit like that. It's to try and get people to buy or see the other thing, right? So okay, cool. So we went through how we know each other as well too. So well, for me actually, like Jared, I'd actually when I was preparing to run Marvel, the Margaret Weiss published Marvel Adventures or whatever, I same thing. Like I got the game and I bounced off it really hard and ended up giving it away. And then I was reading more about it on I can't remember where. So I picked up a copy again to run for my son because he loves gaming, but he's not really a gamer per se. Like he doesn't crunching and really in-depth mechanics aren't a huge thing. So as much as I can find lighter mechanic games and then also appeal to things he loves. He loves Deadpool. He loves Spider-Man. Yeah. So I actually watched your videos to help figure out how things were, like how the game should be run and how it would look at the table. And then when you posted about a year ago, or a little more than a year ago, you wanted to do a 10 session or 11 session thing for Shadow of the Demon Lord. I was like, oh, that guy. So, you know, that's how I knew you.
Oh, and man, let me just say, streaming games online has changed so much between when I did the Marvel one and this one. Like, by no means do I think anyone needs to look at me to see me as an example of anything, because I'm just a guy. But it is really funny because I have so many more hits on those Marvel ones because there wasn't a lot on YouTube showing different people running games of different types. And now it's like, you can't miss people running games online now.
The only thing is, I read an interesting stat from someone. Steve Jackson Games did their like report to the stakeholders recently.
Yeah.
They always share that with their the gamers as well too, like they're on their forums. And one of the things, like the reason I was interested in it was because of Dungeon Fantasy, and because I picked it up and I thought it was cool. I've loved GURPS for a long time, but it's a hard game to get to the table sometimes. And they had mentioned that, you know, there's because of the sort of like gaming renaissance we find ourselves in, where there's so many different games out there, the length of time that a new product sits in that new product shelf is so much shorter now than what it was, say, you know, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So they had no follow-up products for that, so it was out, and then suddenly it was gone, and it's out of people's, you know, unless it's something you're specifically looking for, it's not going to be an impulse buy for them.
Yeah.
But there's a guy who I'll see if I can find the link to it just for the sake of viewers at home if anyone wants to see this. But it was a PhD guy in economics who was talking about the sort of diversity of the marketplace, and the marketplace is like 85% D&D.
Yeah.
At this point, which means that like all non-D&D games, there's 15% of the, you know, of the market that all of those fucking games are fitting in and trying to, you know, have attention drawn to them.
I think that's interesting, but there's another thing that I think is kind of interesting in our modern era, because if you had said that same thing 5 or 10 years ago, it means something different than it means now, because 5 or 10 years ago, we were in a set group. These are people that are gamers. Sometimes they get their kids to play, but otherwise, they're getting kids to play maybe at the same rate that they're dying, maybe not. And I don't mean to be overly grim about that, but I mean, it was not an expanding group of people. What has really happened with D&D 5th edition is there's actually new people coming into this. So while that snapshot now is that D&D is this big amount, if those people stay in gaming, those are more people than have ever been there. And if they just came in the first, second, third year, you know, you and I kind of know this, your first, second, third year, you're not diversifying a whole lot. But if those people actually do love gaming and other games catch their attention, those are people that are going to filter into the rest of that. Now, that doesn't help the Dungeon Fantasy thing now, because that's a snapshot of what's going on now. But I honestly think that if this growth continues and if those people are retained as gamers, that's immense, because this is the first time since I got into gaming back in the 80s that I've really seen this growing and not just contracting or staying the same.
Yeah. And it's I think the streaming, to circle back to that, that's also something that's helping, because it makes it, you can see much more easily from your home, your phone, or whatever, that this is what, you know, gaming actually looks like. This is what you do with that hobby. But with if 85% of the market is D&D stuff, that means like if you've got something that you're streaming that isn't D&D, then there's, you know, there are going to be a specific market for that as well too, and you're not going to get lost necessarily in the, you know, in the noise of other D&D, you know, campaigns. It's actually one of the reasons why I've consciously not been running 5th edition on my channel, is because it's just partly because, I mean, it's there's plenty of other people out there with much better production values on their videos than what I do.
And I'll be honest, is a little bit, this is totally from me and my decisions about what I'm reviewing and what I'm not. I have steered away. I did a review for D&D Beyond, but I've been generally steering away from doing a lot of D&D reviews, not because I don't like 5th edition, but because it doesn't really need the attention.
That's
Like,
cool, 'cause I noticed that you've been doing a lot more narrative and like Apocalypse World type games in your reviews. And I wasn't sure if that was because you're making sort of a shift towards those games, or because, but that makes sense now that this is,
yeah, I love fifth edition. I would love to. I ran Storm King's Thunder last year. I would love to run fifth edition again. I have nothing against, fifth edition, because I mean, I bounce back and forth between traditional games and more narrative games. I don't like setting up too much of a stake on one side of a thing, saying this is always true. It's just they take different things, they do different things, they satisfy different desires for gaming.
Totally.
I hate it when people get too entrenched in their tribal thing, where it's like, no, it must always be this type of game. It's like, oh no, you're losing out on stuff. You know.
I mean, that's this is as post 40 person, but I mean, I feel like that's the older you get, the more like, all right, let's just try this.
Yeah.
And also the more exposure you get to other games as well. If you had told me, there was a time when I was really resistant to the narrative dice in Fantasy Flights games, and then I played it, or then I ran it, and I was like, this is fucking crazy. Like this types of things makes me think of what's missing in other games. It's because it achieves certain results from dice rolls in those games that you cannot get in a binary sort of successful.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back on track.
Oh my god,
it's been so long since we've hung out that it's
Kevin and Jared talk about everything. We're like Ken and Robin, except not anywhere near as many people are going to watch it. I don't. No. So it's a lovely stream. I'm just saying, Ken and Robin like eat up so much of the podcast. Rightly so, not the dig on Ken and Robin.
Yeah. So let's talk about your gaming background. So this, because we're going to get to the point where we're going to talk about where, how you encountered Seventh Sea.
Yes.
So let's tell me a little bit about from, 85 in that magenta box set, up until the time that you ran Shadow of the Demon Lord, let's say.
Yeah. I think basically I've been running or playing games, mostly running, because that's just been who I am, since 1985. I think there's about a 4 or 5 year gap in the 90s when I wasn't gaming. It's for a number of reasons, but adulthood hits and you sit there and go, boy, it was sure nice to play these games. I'll never go back to them again. And then in the 2000s, I was like, oh my God, I got a game again. So,
I think that's a very, very common. As soon as like the bar and girls or boys, depending on your persuasion, become a viable thing, it's playing dragons and whatnot becomes a little less important until
But pre that gap, the thing I ran, no question, the thing I ran the most was AD&D Second Edition.
Yeah.
That wasn't my first version of D&D, but that was by far the version that I ran the most, all over the place. Did you have
a specific setting? Because D&D, for those not familiar with Second Edition was really kind of the renaissance for different settings. It's where TSR, who was the publisher of D&D at the time, decided to put out a shit ton of different types of worlds, so you could play in very, very different feeling, and in some cases mechanically playing differently settings. Did you have one or a couple that you lean towards?
What was really nice about my gaming group at the time was I started off GMing, but for one thing, when we were in high school, we played a crazy amount. Like we would literally I would show up at my friend's house at like 10 o'clock in the morning. We would play until like 1 o'clock in the morning, and we might take lunch breaks, but what happened was the longer we played, the more some of my other friends would DM things, and that setting renaissance was really awesome for us, because what happened was I love Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance, so I would run Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance. I also, as crazy as it is, I love Spelljammer too. So when Spelljammer came out, I would start running Spelljammer. So those were kind of my three, main things that I was running there. One of my friends would run Greyhawk, and another friend would run Ravenloft. And that was great, because then I actually got the perspective of being a player in someone else's game. They didn't DM quite as much as I did, but at least I had that interplay, and I got to see these other settings, and it was really nice. It was something that I really enjoyed about all that. I really, really, really love the Forgotten Realms. I am not by any means going to tell anyone there are not problems with the setting. I don't want to tell anyone how to enjoy the setting. I'm just going to say that there are things that inspired me about the old Grey box set, which is the original version of the campaign setting, that when you follow those threads through the setting, I still love those things. There were a lot of things that got bolted on that I don't think are in the same vein as what appeared in the old gray box set.
Emmy. All right. Sorry, go ahead.
No. There's just a lot of things that kind of got bolted on that I don't think feel in that same vein as the old gray box set.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a setting I loved a long time. I actually wrote a bunch of articles for Candlekeep. It's a fan site for the Forgotten Realms, so I have a bunch of fan articles there because that's a lot of what I was doing when I was getting back into gaming in the early 2000s. And the weird thing for me is anything that feels like this is the fusion that I actually liked about the realms that is hard to explain to people sometimes when they look at it and say, oh, it's generic fantasy. There is a very specific feel, especially with stuff that like Ed Greenwood wrote and stuff that Jeff Grubb wrote early on. Whereas there is this interesting fusion of this love of home and grandeur and how beautiful things are from the Lord of the Rings with adventurers being rock stars from like Fafhrd and Mauser. And it's like, it literally is kind of like this mixture of both of those. It's not necessarily that adventurers are going to be morally upright, awesome heroes, but they're also going to love hanging out at their house sometime and just talk about how neat this food is, you know?
So I know that Greenwood stuff is like the Dales, and is Cormier his as well?
Yeah, his where his campaign started, he ran a couple early on, but basically he had characters that started in Cormier, they moved to the Dale lands, and then he had another group that he was running in the Waterdeep area. So the places that have the most
Waterdeep, of course,
Greenwood details are Waterdeep, the Dale lands, and Cormier.
And then Grubb is what, the Moonshae Isles?
Well, no, Jeff Grubb. What was interesting, Jeff Grubb ended up being the traffic cop for the setting, basically. Where what that meant initially was he was getting literally all of these gigantic bundles of things from Ed Greenwood and trying to translate them from Greenwoodian text into at the table. Because Ed is great, and I love his setting details. Ed can ramble on longer than we can. So so basically what Jeff Grubb was doing a lot for the setting was kind of taking some of these things and saying, oh, so your point is this, and then kind of condensing it down to that. And also as like the novels and adventures started coming out early on, there was a little bit more cohesion with some of the feel because Jeff Grubb was the traffic cop for TSR, which grew to mean that he was controlling the continuity of things. Like if someone mentioned this thing in this novel, that's a thing they want to mention in a source book so that it's true now, you know, so that it's across the board. They did kind of get away from having traffic cops, which shows in a lot of places because there are time periods both in second and third edition where the Forgotten Realms feels like, hey, everything in D&D is here somewhere. It's a setting. Have fun. Yeah,
that's like I was a much more casual Forgotten Realms guy. There was sort of a friend of mine had really sort of pegged that as his setting, so I did other things. And I was honestly like the basic D&D stuff. The Mystara was really my first sort of like first love. I'm thinking of the Bloodstone Lands setting. Like that book made no fucking sense to me. I love the idea of Damara and Vesa and whatnot, but like trying to meld what's his name's Bob Salvatore's ideas with the pre-existing.
And what's interesting about that is the Bloodstone Land adventures. They had R.A. Salvatore write the source book for that, but the actual adventures were written by Doug Niles, who was also the person who did the Moonshae Isles. Both things that got bolted on separately because the Moonshae Isles the Moonshaes are almost more like, to bring it back to our big topic, even though we're wandering all over the place, the Moonshaes are almost more like how 7C does something, where it is literally a thing from history where some of these myths are true and you can very much see what cultures they're trying to emulate. Greenwood's approach was more like, this is sort of like that setting, but not really. Like, you know, I think the most blatant thing that Ed put in the realms was probably Kalimshan being, you know, kind of the Arabian thing, but there's no like, there's a lot of stuff that isn't. It just looks like it, like, oh, there's scimitars and flying carpets and genies, but there's all this other weird native Realmsian stuff in here too. Whereas a lot of stuff that got bolted on by other people is, oh, this is just this thing from the real world.
Yeah.
And that.
So how do you think that experience with and your perspective on the realms like that, how do you think that sort of shaped your early DMing sort of approach and like how you manage campaigns?
It's really weird because it did start to teach me that there are certain authors and certain people, if I saw that they wrote a source book, I knew I would be more likely to include that information than other people. Like if I saw somebody's name that was brand new, I would read their stuff and think, oh, this feels like this or not. But you know, it was something like if I knew something that Jeff Grubb was putting out or something that Ed Greenwood was putting out, or later on like Stephen Shend, I would see that stuff and go, I know this stuff. I'm not worried about this. But then, you know, you would get somebody, especially when you would see somebody that had really been associated with another setting and they brought them over to write something. I was like, I don't know about this. Not that they're a bad writer, just that I don't know that they understand the feel of the setting and what to emphasize and what not to emphasize.
So with knowing that those are the settings and knowing that you sort of you dug the idea of the players sort of becoming rock stars as well too, or at least as that as being part of the setting, it sounds like you your approach was more of a narrative approach to campaign design or like a plot approach rather than the sandboxy stuff that like predated the Dragonlance novels.
Yeah, because what I tended to like is hopefully you guys saw this too, like in Shadow of the Demon Lord, I would have a broad outline, but when people would do a certain thing, it's like, this is when X happens. It doesn't have to happen any specific way. I've noticed I am not good at sandboxes. I actually tried a sandbox. The most recent time that I tried a sandbox was running. I had a mashed up, man, I was so ambitious with this campaign and it just did not work. It was a mashup of Age of Rebellion, Edge of the Empire, and Force and Destiny, where the group was a group of Inquisitors and a bounty hunter working for the Empire and a military droid were sent into this region that bordered Hutt space, and they were just sent there to root out corruption and look for Force sensitives and everything. And I had tons of little plot seeds all over the place where it's like, oh, the Moff is going to stage a coup against the Emperor, and here's these Force sensitive pirates that you either have to convert or, you know, get rid of. And there's a rebel cell here in this area, and there's an Imperial contractor that's actually bilking the Empire out of money. And they went there. Problem number one that I should have foreseen, one of the Inquisitors was a Hutt. So basically what they do is they get there, someone offers them a bribe, they say, cool. There you go.
Yeah.
That was the sandbox.
Jeez. Yeah. Was that with a group of players that you had played with before?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, see, it's funny. I had like, I don't want to get distracted by this, but my Traveler campaign that I'm running right now, I'm running this it's Pirates of Draenax. It's this published campaign. It's really fucking cool, but it's with guys who I have played with for years and years and years, where I've run the games in a narrative sort of plot-based way. So that we had to have a whole like hour-long conversation after one session to be like, guys, this world's reacting to you. It doesn't involve, so it's a different like language that you use to communicate, you know, what the players need to do and how they're going to interact with the world and whatnot.
And a lot of the players in that game are in my 7C game too. I mean, I've played with them before. It's just, we all kind of collectively realized full sandbox is probably not a thing that's going to work for this group.
Well, I've been talking to a buddy of mine at our local gaming store, and I'm talking to a mutual friend of ours, Jason Hobbs. Hobbs runs a West Marches game that I play in, and it's been really, really interesting playing in that game because it's a totally different. Like having actually played in a sandbox relatively recently really helped me figure out what the problems were with my Traveler campaign and how better to address that stuff. Just because it's a totally different animal of how you interact as a player with that kind of game. And Hobbs it's great because he has a very, very no nonsense of like, look, what the fuck are you gonna do? You tell me or I'm gonna do nothing.
I know. So, Hobbs is awesome. Hopefully I'll get to check in with him when I go to GaryCon in a couple weeks because
that's exciting. Oh shit, I'm jealous as hell. You guys gotta get photos together. Yeah, he's probably busy. He's quite the rock star in the community. So
But
Okay,
yeah,
so
to get way back to what you were saying, yeah, I ran second edition most. I also, the next two things that I ran probably the most in that pre-break period is Marvel Superheroes and Star Frontiers. Star Frontiers was a big one for me. I love that. For some reason, as soon as the Zebulon's guide came out, though, and I started showing people how things worked, like our interest just slowly died from that point because they're like, this is supposed to be the same game, but it's like they're completely changing the core mechanics, but it's not a new edition.
that's one of the things where I never picked up Star Frontiers, and I never actually played it. I'm not sure I've even actually read it before. I'm familiar with the things because of like there was that great like weird ad in the back of comic books about like some alien going in and stealing some. So I was aware of the game, and I love the Larry Elmore cover.
Oh yeah, I love that. That's probably my third most. It's my third most run and probably my third favorite of all of the things that I did in that pre-gaming thing. The funny thing is, there are things that I missed because of the period in the 90s when I got out of gaming, which are things that there's so many people now is a touchstone for them. And it's weird because
like World of Darkness or
World of Darkness, first edition 7C, I wasn't there for that.
Not saying like, oh, you really missed like the setting material is great in that, but that is an unplayable game. So like it's cool now, and I loved it because I was into Five Rings at the time.
Yeah,
in a big way.
Another one that I was not around when that hit big. Really? Shadowrun started when I was still gaming, but I didn't get into it, and like all the people that I gamed with ended up going off to college and playing Shadowrun and saying, "Oh, this is an awesome game." It's like, "Oh, that's great. You got to run it for me." Yeah, someday if we ever have time, and it just never,
Yeah. Did you ever get into BattleTech?
Oh yeah, definitely got into BattleTech. I think the reason I didn't bring it up here is because we didn't do the RPG side of it much. We played Mech Warrior a little bit, but most of it was just us, running fights against each other, and I love Warhammers, but
yeah. Okay, cool. So, well, in leading up to when 7C Second Edition came out, what was the sort of like what was your go-to games at that time?
Well, see, that the funny thing was, I didn't quit following gaming, but I wasn't gaming for about 2015 or so. Like all of my gaming groups, I left one job that I was at for 12 years, went back to school. So I was playing Adventurers League, and that was about it. So I didn't want to completely get out of gaming, but I wasn't doing a lot of active stuff. And I saw the Kickstarter for it, and I was still in school, so I wasn't going to get in on that.
Yeah.
But it looked interesting to me, and it's really the thing that's kind of cool is if you've ever read Rob Donahue's blog, he's one of the people that owns Evil Hat. He's one of the people that does Fate and everything. He started blogging about 7C and what he was expecting out of it and everything, and that actually really got my interest in it because Rob, if you've never read Rob's blog, he does a really fascinating breakdown of just game mechanics and why games work and why they don't, and that's actually it got me interested in both 7C and Blades in the Dark because he started talking about Blades in the Dark too, which I haven't got to the table, but at least I've gotten to play in one now. But
nice. Cool.
Yeah, at a local convention, I actually got to play in a Blades in the Dark game. But yeah, it was a lot of that was just I saw it and I was like, oh, seems to be really popular, and I like pirates, but I didn't jump in on it. But reading Rob's post, I was like, this is really interesting.
Have you played any of the Star Wars, the Fantasy Flight Star Wars, or like the Fantasy Flight Warhammer Fantasy before?
I didn't. I actually did run. This was crazy. This one actually worked. I ran 2 different groups in Edge of the Empire as soon as it came out. They were both working for the same guy, but it was 2 different teams of people, and I was running it on alternate Thursdays. And every once in a while, something would happen in one of those things that would weave into the story in the other one. And it was a lot of fun. I'm surprised that it worked out as well as it did. And what was kind of cool was when somebody needed to change Thursdays, it was really easy to just say that they just changed what team they were working with because they were still working for the same guy. So, I mean, it was a neat experience. So, yeah, I ran quite a bit of Edge of the Empire.
Okay. The reason I ask is because I felt like the mechanic in that, like the For those unfamiliar at home, the way that the Star Wars Fantasy Flight game works is it uses proprietary dice, and you build a dice pool that includes both your ability, or like your capability of doing something, and then also the difficulty or complications, all into one sort of dice pool. You roll, and then in addition to measuring your degree of success and your degree of failure, there's an independent axis that can measure whether something incidentally good or incidentally bad happens. So you can have these interesting results where you can succeed at something, but something shitty also happens, or you can totally fail at something, but something really good happens. The best example of the really shitty but really good thing I've had it in my time running Star Wars was a player totally fucking botched his role on piloting when he decided to go at full bore through this like tunnel in an asteroid where there was a starbase inside. Ruined his thing, but he rolled a triumph, which is like a critical hit. So he totally failed, but then when he crashed, the guy he was trying to meet up with happened to be there and was like, that was awesome.
We had it actually worked out the opposite direction, but we have a joke about how the first piloting role of any campaign is going to be terrible. And that's not just Fantasy Flight Star Wars. Any Star Wars game I have ever run, I ran like a Saga system. The first roll, the pilot rolled a 1, and the other guy was sitting there going, I'm sitting in the co-pilot seat. Can I save this? I was like, you can give it a try. He also rolls a 1. So the campaign started with their transport ship crashing into the Jedi Temple.
That's terrific. Oh, so that's the thing that I think. So like the reason I mentioned that the narrative mechanic is because it's different than anything else I've I've ever run. Like you have critical hits and critical failures in other games, but having them independent and like decoupled from the success or failure of a dice roll made for really interesting and story driving sort of results where things would happen and you'd be like, oh, I didn't anticipate that, so now I've got to adapt my story for them.
Yeah.
And I think like when I was approaching 7th Sea 2nd edition, I was kind of hoping that, oh, I'm going to be able to do a lot of sort of that stuff. Like it's going to be a different, more narrative game where, we're not really slavishly paying attention to what the dice results are. We're just interpreting them in a kind of oracular, way.
Yeah, I was gonna say 7th Sea is in some way it's kind of the opposite of what that does, because you're really having to intentionally build the scene structure and the things that could happen, not necessarily the things that will happen, but the things that could happen that players can push in a certain direction or another direction. But you're not ever really going to be surprised by what happens. You're just going to see what results people would rather see happen. So in a way, it's kind of interesting because this is something that I know about myself. I know some people really, really like novelty. Like when they see a plot of something, they want to say, I've never seen that plot before, which, spoiler, you've seen that plot before.
Yeah.
Human beings have been around, what, 20,000 years? We've done all of these stories. Trust me. We put them together slightly differently, but they're the same stories. But I would almost rather see a good expression of tropes coming out than to try and do something completely new. Like if people are engaged and excited that they've done something that is still a trope, I would rather see that than say, wow, this was a really great plot twist. I mean, I didn't feel really engaged, but it was a great plot twist. It's almost, I mean, it's kind of the equivalent. If I were a director, because, this is my natural thing that I fall into, I would rather have those movies where, yeah, it's really predictable, but man, the actors were really engaged and they were really, everything. I knew where it was going, but I really enjoyed the ride. And that's probably more the directorial type that I would be were I ever actually have any talent in that direction. That's the feeling that I get about things.
Well, and it's a different, like with the games too, it's a different kind of engagement. It's not going passively through a story. You're actually engaging. And I think that if there are some of those common beats or those, there's a rough path that they're familiar with, even if it's a different, it's got different things along the way and whatnot. That helps people figure out what they're, in particular in a story-driven game or a narrative-driven game, it helps them figure out how to get through that material, right?
Right.
And there's actually, so there's a book, I think it's called The 28 Narrative Premises. It's a guy named George Pulte. And it was referenced really heavily in earlier editions of Legend of the Five Rings,
Mhm.
the first edition DM's book. And what it does is basically it not synthesize, like sort of like streamlines those things and says, like, look, these are the sort of like 28 types of conflicts you can have in a story. Take these as ideas for how to create your own stories. You
Yeah.
know,
And this was way before I got there, so I have no hand in this. But um, a bunch of the guys at Gnomes Do, through Engine Publishing, put out a book called Eureka, which actually takes those and they frame a whole bunch of different versions of those, the basic plot.
Yep.
But then frame it for, like, there's a section on science fiction and how you can, and they actually have it under the category of this plot, but then they give you like 2 or 3 paragraphs to flesh out what a game session would look like based on that plot.
Oh,
And
that's
that was
really cool.
that was a really neat book. I really like that. And I'll plug fellow gnomes. I had nothing to do with that because that was years ago. But I mean, it's a really neat book. So if you ever get a chance to look at Eureka, that was a cool book.
Oh, cool. I'll have to check that out then. So before we get into 7th Sea itself, so prior to 7th Sea, what's the game? I think I know the answer to this. What's your first sort of default game to go to? Like when you think of like, because I imagine you're like me, where like you see anything, you're like, ooh, I could do that in a game.
Yeah.
Ooh, I could do that in a game. It's really sad. That's my first thing of like.
Yeah, I think what's really funny is I think like anything D20 based is very naturally ingrained in me because I've run so much of it. Like when I got back into gaming, I ran a ton of 3.5. I ran a year-long DC Adventures. So like even though it's not quite the same, some of the idea of the D20 and the difficulty number and the adding the bonus to it and things like that, all of that naturally clicks for me, which is funny because it's not what I'm running a lot of at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But it is one of those things where it's like if I start reading a D20 based thing, especially if it deals with levels and things like that, it's like, oh yeah, I completely understand this. It doesn't, it kind of feels comfortable, even if it's not necessarily what I want to do at the moment. It's sort of like that default, like I could eat McDonald's, But I think, but for genres, I either like more traditional fantasy or superheroes are the 2 genres that I just naturally kind of gravitate to as far as genres in games.
Okay. And then what, prior to engaging with 7th Sea, how would you sort of describe your DM style? What's your, I know I got your thing is, I've seen it from the side of the player screen, and I would disagree that you're a pushover GM.
I'm sort of a pushover GM because when I say that, I think I've gotten better at utilizing that for good. When I was younger, I would get these starry-eyed things where it was like, oh, I read this in a novel and I really want these guys to do it. So I would like bend over backwards to give them the ability to do a thing, even when I understand now, narratively, it probably would have been a better beat to have them fail and then have to work their way back up and do it again. I was sitting there going, here, you've got this sword that gives you a one-time +10 bonus, so you could kill the villain now. I'm not saying you have to, but you could do it.
That's great.
And so I would do stuff like that, and it was terrible, but it was like there's a principle in most Powered by the Apocalypse game, which is be a fan of the players, which is, it doesn't mean not to challenge them, but it means you're not trying to play gotcha with them where you're saying, well, because of this rule on page 28, technically that didn't work. You're actually at a -2, so you failed. It's more of I want you to do awesome stuff. I'm going to throw stuff at you that makes it harder, but in the end, I actually want you to be the hero.
Yeah, and I think a more accurate way to put that is that you're an enabling GM, so, which is great because I mean, like, as a player or having played through one of your campaigns, it was evident that you were giving us cool things to do, as well as some of the things were a walkover. That fight with the Lich, I still fucking complain about because that fucking liches are so deadly in Shadow of the Demon Lord.
And I didn't plan for that specific moment, but that was a story beat thing. Because you guys had done a lot of things and you had some moments that were neutral, you had some moments that were up where you got things, and it was like, now is the time, whatever they do, I need to put the screws on hard. That was really like, this is the time when they get to prove that they're big damn heroes, and that's when.
Yeah, and it helped like at I didn't at the time. I didn't feel like I was doing an awful lot in the session, but in retrospect, speaking to the other players and speaking to Steve in particular, like I was the tank, so of course I was going to have the shit kicked out of me over and over again because that's what my role was.
Yeah, and I feel bad if you didn't feel as fulfilled, but I mean, if you were not there in that fight, the Lich would have probably killed everyone else because you could take more damage than anyone, and it was focusing on you, so everyone could stay alive long enough to. And I actually love that Ryan came up with a let's not fight the Lich directly to defeat it.
Yeah.
Thing.
Yeah.
Because that was actually the best way to go about that, and I was really glad that came about without me, dangling it a little bit too obviously to say, here's something you could do instead. Here's that +10 sword,
Yeah. Well, I mean, Ryan's one of your long-term players too, right? Yeah. So it's cool that you guys have already that. He knew that he could get away with doing something like that. That wasn't an obvious, pull this lever kind of thing. And and you would say, yeah, okay, no, that makes sense. That would be a way of resolving this.
And the funny thing is, I will intentionally, this is just it's a weird peek into my brain. There are times when I put something in there where it's like, this is a way they could win it, and I put that in there. There are also times when I will just randomly throw a detail in here and go, I want to see what they do with this.
Yeah.
Just to see. And it's not a thing that I have any mechanics for. It's just like, if this is a thing, this thing is true about this thing. And, just let somebody grab that and do whatever they're going to do with it.
Well, it's not. I've actually, it's in particular for the more powerful the players are in a game, like in superhero games or whatever. I don't ever try and figure out how they're going to get out of something because they're going to come up with some fucking way of doing it.
Yeah,
and to try and think through all the permutations of how they might do those things, in particular in supers games, is just.
I did that when I ran D&D 3.5. I never forced anyone to resolve something a specific way. But I would spend so much time trying to guess at it so that I could put notes in my my adventure that I was going to run that says, well, if they do this, then this is true. And then look up these rules on this page. If they do this, then this is true. And I just got to the point to where it's like, they're not going to do any of these. Or if they do any of these, they're going to do half of this one and half of this one.
Yeah.
Just stop.
Yeah. So I think, knowing how much experience you've got with third, I think we need to table a second conversation at some point later to talk about that. Because there's some really interesting stuff about how that changed sort of like the zeitgeist of what, D&D gaming is.
Yeah.
And what makes it an encounter, but that's way beyond what we can talk about today.
Oh, yeah. I will throw one brief thing out there.
Sure, yeah.
Fifth feels a lot more to me like when I was running in second edition.
Absolutely. Yeah. Fifth is honestly, like fifth is the best of sort of all worlds. It feels like I had recently went back and did a pretty substantial revisiting of fourth edition. And I enjoyed that edition an awful lot as a player. And I enjoy it as a DM when everybody else is as invested in the mechanics as what I am.
Yeah.
I made the transition I changed the game, still same campaign, still same players, but I've transitioned to running it with Shadow of the Demon Lord recently, which is working much better with the group of players that I'm playing with, just because it doesn't work unless you've got everyone on that same sort of page.
Definitely.
Where fifth edition, you can play a more tactical, crunchy kind of game, and you can play more of a loosey-goosey theater of the mind thing. And it's equally satisfying.
Yeah. And you can even have people in the same party that aren't engaging the exact same way and still get something out of it.
Totally. Yeah. I've got one player in one of my games who he just likes making people laugh. So he'll do shit to sort of like surprise me and surprise the other players, and not in a like intentionally disruptive way, just a really funny, so, and it's great because having that little bit of like, agent of chaos in your group really keeps the fresh. So let's now maybe transition to the 7th Sea. So you've got more experience running second edition than what I do. So why don't you tell us what 7th Sea is about? Like, what's the elevator pitch for this game?
I don't know if this is how they would pitch it, but at least the way it coalesced in my brain when I was starting to read it is it's sort of like
the people can go to the website and read whatever thing 7th Sea wants to say. What's to you? What was the game going to be about?
Basically, if you took like Princess Bride and the Three Musketeers and the Pirates of the Caribbean movie and you put all of those in a blender, that's what 7th Sea is. It is very much that like 17th century swashbuckling thing, but it's not focused on just one thing. It's not just being, agents of the crown, or it's not just being pirates. It's kind of taking that whole thing, but there are a lot of common elements in all of that swashbuckling type fiction. And I especially want to throw like Pirates of the Caribbean in there because there's also that supernatural element. There's ghosts and there's monsters and there's things like that going on in the setting as well, on top of the typical swashbuckling type thing in the storyline.
Yeah, and I think there's this was more a touchstone for the earlier edition, but there's an old French film called Brotherhood of the Wolf. That's a sort of a weird like action horror thing set in around the same time as this period. And I think that in particular for Ison, both the first and second edition versions of Ison, it really has that flavor.
Yeah.
The game isn't, to be clear too, it's not a historical game. It's set in a fictional world, but the fictional countries that are in there have very clear cognates from.
Yeah, it is a very direct correlation, but it's not the exact same history. So there's a little bit of freedom to do things differently. One thing that I really actually do like about it, because this is actually a problem I have sometimes with Westerns, is that they have changed things where there are some of the traditional things that happened in history were attempted but didn't work on the same scale. So you don't have entire cultures being wiped out by colonialism, and slavery exists, but it's much more contained, and it's this one evil organization that really promotes it. So it's not this. I like that, and I know sometimes I honestly think even in games you need to confront uncomfortable things and realize what the repercussions of those things are and deal with them. But for a swashbuckling type game, I think it's much better to be able to say, see someone from this culture, they can be a hero too. And, I think that's really important.
Yeah. And I mean, like, there's certainly, one perspective on it would be that it's whitewashing history. But I mean, I think that what it's choosing to do is to focus on more the heroic tropes of that material, and then elevate the traditionally disenfranchised cultures or characters or whatnot to being, and women in particular in the game. Women have a much more prominent place in this and are much more able to engage with all aspects of the society and whatnot than what you could in a strictly historical game.
And I realize the irony of two white guys talking about this is, it's hard to completely get past that. But I do like the idea that it's not going to be a thing where, I mean, they even mentioned that because of all of the trade and traffic and everything, if you have someone who is black from the Glamour Isles, that's not a big thing. His family may be from there, and the Glamour Isles is, for anybody, that's the British Isles, basically.
Yeah.
It's the whole point is, even though there are also traditional African and Middle Eastern and other countries in there, you can also just say that you're from this place, and that makes perfect sense in the setting. There's nothing that contradicts the fact that you could be from there.
Yeah. One significant improvement in the setting between first edition and second edition is that first edition had the same European or like quasi-European countries in it, but it really didn't have any other part of the world. It made no fucking sense. Because the whole reason you have an age of piracy is because of New World silver.
Yeah.
Right? Like the reason that there is ships full of treasure that are out there to be captured is because of the Spanish and Portuguese and later British and Dutch exploration of the New World, right? So, and then also the spice trade out to, all the rest of the world. And to take that out and basically say like, well, you just kind of sail around these different, European countries.
And that was one of the things, that's one of the things that Rob Donahue hit a lot in his blog, where he was talking about how, I'm backing this, but I really hope that they don't make the same mistake that they made in first edition, which I didn't read any of this, but I was reading that in his blog, where it was like, it's just so Eurocentric, not just Eurocentric, like from this point of view, like that's all that exists. That's it.
Well, yeah. And there's also so they've got a version of the Christian church in there too, but in the original version, there were no Jews, no versions of Jews. There was just there was Christians, and there's sort of like quasi-Christians and quasi-Muslims, and that's it.
Yeah.
So it was a really oh boy.
And that is definitely something just from the setting information. They flesh out a lot of, in Pirate Nations, they go into a lot of the Caribbean countries. Yep. Those are included in there. They have a section on Greece in there now in some of the books. There is going to be a source book on Ifri, which is the African continent.
Mm-hmm.
The Crescent Empire came out, which is basically like the whole Ottoman region. But one of the interesting things in there, which you just pointed out, one of the nations there is the Israelite, portion of that section, where there is a Jewish nation, and there's a section that talks about the differences between. What's really interesting, they don't go into deep theological differences, but they do have a parallel between Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and where they're similar and where they broke off. And it is a much simplified thing, but that's what you kind of want for a swashbuckling game. But it exists there. It's not just completely.
And I mean, not to belabor the historical part too, but I mean, part of the conflict that drives the like the Scarlet Pimpernel, if I recall, is about like rescuing Protestants from Catholic France, right? Like that's so like religious conflict is one of those sort of driving sources of conflict you can have in that setting. So
and it's nice because it's zoomed out just enough that it doesn't feel like you're arguing a real world position.
Yeah.
But you have the same type of conflict that you can have in there, which I do kind of like about that too. Yeah.
And I think that one nice thing with it too is there aren't cultural bad guys and cultural good guys in the game.
Yeah, that is one thing. When I mentioned the thing about slavery, they have very much focused on the ATC, which is kind of like the East India Trading Company type thing. They are the people trying to promote slavery. It's not any of the nations. It is very much this evil company of people, which is basically like the worst version of any capitalism you could possibly see in the ATC here. They are kind of the whole, the whole of that. Yeah. And they're kind of the face of, kick these slavers' ass. I mean, that's kind of the way it presents it.
That's, I think, a pretty close second to wanting to punch Nazis in a role-playing game. Right? Like, it's really okay. Cool. So let's maybe let's talk about the crunchiness part of it now. So there is one kind of core mechanic that drives all the anything that requires intervention of dice to determine whether you're succeeding or failing is driven by this one core mechanic. Do you want to give us a quick overview of what that is?
Yeah, at the very basic, it's called a risk. Anytime you do something and it's not just assumed that you will do the thing, that there's any kind of dramatic purpose to the thing, it's called a risk. And what you do is you have attributes and you have skills. And you don't just add these two together, you describe your approach to the problem, what you are doing to do the thing. And then once you describe that, you map it to an attribute and a skill. And what's really interesting about that is that means that even though there's some things that you would think go together, depending on how someone describes it, they don't necessarily have to go together. Like I've had people, reason about using wits and athletics. Like I'm going to physically do a thing, but I'm going to plan out, and they'll explain that I'm going to work out all the angles on this thing. And if it makes sense for the character in the situation, that's the die pool that you have. You don't necessarily force it to be, no, that would just be, strength. But once someone describes their approach and you agree on what the skill and the attribute is, they'll roll the die pool and they'll make 10s. For each 10 that they get a raise. Each raise, the way 7th works is you don't really fail at anything. For each raise, you can narrate that you did a thing. That's why it's an approach, and it's usually not something like, can you pick a lock or not pick a lock? It's usually, can you break into a house? So that there's steps to doing this thing, because what it's trying to frame is scenes. It's not trying to frame a single thing that you're doing.
Yeah. It's the mechanic. Is it fair to say that the mechanic is a very, very arch narrative approach to resolving, conflict scene? It's not simulationist at all.
No, it is definitely not simulationist. But there is a possibility. They do say that if you absolutely cannot make 10s with a die pool, which I have never seen anyone not be able to make at least 1 10. But they even say in that case, you should probably still let them succeed at a thing that they're trying to do. It's just you get to throw something crazy in there because something had to happen that they couldn't even, pull together that 1 10 there.
Mhm.
But there is also a mechanic which is kind of interesting, and we won't get too far afield on this, but you can just declare that you fail, and you get a hero point for that, which you can use to re-roll or add dice to die pools and things like that. But the only way you fail is for you to say that you fail. And it's really interesting because, you know, coming from a more simulationist side of things, you would probably say, why would I ever say that I failed? But coming from a trying to tell a story, it makes perfect sense that sometimes somebody would just fail at something.
Yeah.
You know, this is the dramatic point at which everything hinges on them and they're going to screw it up, you know, and it just makes sense for that character in that moment.
Well, there's also, I mean, you get the benefit of the hero point as well, too, right? So there's
Yes.
there's a for the more game, like
Yes.
gamey oriented player, there's a mechanical benefit to
Yeah, if
taking
you want
that
to do
choice.
something cooler later, you may still want to say, I fail,
Mhm.
but there really should be consequences for you failing. You know, in a fight, it's really easy because you're just not helping your friends any, and some people are probably going to be beating you up and you can't defend yourself. But like any other time, like if you were trying to break into the house and say I fail, your consequence is probably going to be like guards are going to show up and either arrest you or you're going to have to fight your way out of that. So
Mhm.
there's got to be a consequence to that failure, but you can determine, you know, this is the point where I want to build up a bunch of hero points and I'm going to screw this up. I'm going to screw this up. But then when we get that last scene, I'm going to be awesome. And I'm just going to start throwing these out there. So it's kind of a self-pacing thing that the player can do for their character.
Am I right in thinking that the players, apart from villains, which are a specific thing in the
Yes.
game too, apart from the villains, there's really no other part of the world that acts on the players directly.
Right. Yeah. When you have the way things are broken up, if you're just going to do like a single thing with a single character, one person rolls a risk. They tell you what they're planning on doing. Well, actually, you frame the scene. They tell you what they're going to do in that scene, and you assemble the die pool. They have however many raises that they're going to have, and that's how many things they can accomplish in that scene.
Yeah.
And you know, and if they change from their approach, it costs more raises.
Yeah.
So, like if somebody's sneaking into a place and then they realize that, oh man, I have to lift this big heavy thing, however that, you know, works out. Lifting a big heavy thing has nothing to do with what they describe, so that actually costs them an extra raise. So you can't just narrate
Yeah.
whatever and then just use all of the raises. You have to realize that every once in a while when you have to do something that's not directly related to it, it's going to cost you more to do that thing. But you that's if you do a single raise. There are
Okay.
scenes called dramatic scenes, and dramatic scenes are, let's say you're trying to gather information at a formal dress ball. Everybody's going to be in on this, so everybody rolls their risk, and they generate how many raises that they have. Now, through the course of this thing, once you're out of raises, you're not acting in the scene anymore, but you're still in the scene. There are certain abilities that you can still trigger with hero points, so you can still contribute to the scene. But the point is once you're out of that, you're out of that. And when it comes to dramatic scenes, once everyone's out of raises, that dramatic scene is over. Like nothing acts on you in those things. It's just what all can you accomplish? You know, what are you narrating that you get done with your raises before everyone's out? And
So
then
is
at the
it
end of that, it's kind of a trigger that this scene is over.
at the table? Is it kind of like a montage then? Is the way you guys describe that?
Yeah,
Or
it is. Every once in a while, there'll be something that is logical that has to happen before something else. Like, for example, if it's something where people are trying to sneak into a place, you can't really start narrating that you've done stuff until you've spent a raise to say that you got into a place.
yeah.
But, you know, in general, like I had people set off a trap and we kind of zoomed out to figure out how would you know that this was a trap? How would you know that this is going on? Because it's not like in D&D where it's like you were in this hallway, it was on this square, that's where the trap triggered. It was, no, it's a consequence in the scene that if somebody does this and doesn't spend a raise to notice that there's a danger in here, something is going to happen, and they didn't spend that, and then something happened, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we have to deal with that now.
You bring up an interesting sort of extrapolation from that mechanic as well, or sort of implementation is consequences, and I think they're called opportunities.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Right. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what those two things are?
Yes. A consequence is something that if you do not spend a raise to mitigate that thing, it will happen at the end of everyone spending their raises.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get to the end of everyone spending their raises, if no one has done anything that gets rid of that consequence happens. Opportunities are things that you set in there. It may not necessarily be the point of the scene, but they are things that people may want to get out of the scene. So, for example, let's say you were breaking into a house to specifically steal things, you might have like your opportunity is you get 1 wealth for every opportunity that you activate, which is showing that you're grabbing some expensive things as you're going through the house. I might also throw another opportunity in there. You notice a specific danger in the house. That may be that there's a trap, but you would phrase it that way because you don't want to say you see a trap. It might just be something where, oh, there's guard dogs here too. But until somebody, says that, hey, I'm going to specifically, because somebody might just say, I want to get all the wealth I can. So, once they say that, yeah, I was really vigilant and I was looking out for blah, blah, blah. And then you can kind of backfill a little bit once they say that, yeah, I was being vigilant, making sure that nothing surprised us or came up behind us that we weren't prepared for. And once they do something like that, then you can say, oh, you noticed this little pressure plate here that if you stepped on, it was going to cause this problem. So there's that. So basically, opportunities are just a bunch of things that you don't necessarily have to do, that you tell them ahead of time that they can get. And then consequences are just something, this will happen at the end of this turn if you don't deal with it.
Yeah, so like it's 2 other ways of spending the raises apart from just succeeding or failing with your stuff. Is because I think one of the example for the opportunity they give and for consequences they give in the rule book is running through a burning room with collapsing timbers. And the consequence is getting tagged by one of those timbers, and the benefit is grabbing that note and getting it out before it's consumed by the flames, right?
Since I just ran a session last night, I had a situation where a room was filling up with water. And there were a bunch of prisoners that they had just found out were being kept here. They were political prisoners that weren't necessarily criminals or anything. So they realized even, this wasn't their main mission, but they were like, oh man, we can't let these people be trapped down here. So for each opportunity that they triggered, they could get one of them hoisted up out of where the water was going to be a danger for them.
Cool.
So that was a thing. And that is another thing when you start structuring these things, depending on how you phrase it, like there's 10 people there. So the obvious thing is that's 10 separate raises you would have to spend to get all of them out of there. However, if you're going to be flexible, like with how my players were, they were like, well, what if we take that cage that you told us that they lowered the guard dogs into this area with, we shove all of them into that cage and crank that up. And what I told them there, because that's not something that I set in the scene already, what the rules also tell you is you can create an opportunity for someone else to cash in. That is what I told them was, it's still not just going to be one raise to get all 10 of these people out here. But I did say, if somebody wants to if one person wants to convince all of them to get into the cage and the other person wants to actually, make sure the cage is hooked up, once those things are set up as opportunities, someone else can cash in those raises. And then instead of spending 10, you just spent 4 and got everybody out. So that was a thing that just kind of developed in the narrative, where it was, in a way, it's an economic thing for things, but it actually encourages them to be narratively more creative than just to say, I push this person out, I push this person out. And I kind of liked how that developed yesterday. That was one of the things that kind of came out of last night's session.
So when you're playing at the table, then is sort of the way that it goes is you'll give the scene, everyone will talk, discuss what their approach is going to be. You roll the dice, count your raises, and then you start narrating through the scene.
I think what I usually do is I'll frame where they're at, and because obviously, like if somebody, like for example, our Knight of Avalon is very focused on his reputation and being popular with the ladies. So if he wants to narrate like chatting up someone locally that is an attractive woman, I'm not going to make him run any raises unless she's like secretly a spy or something like that. So there's a certain amount of stuff where if people are just saying that they're doing things, I'm just hearing what they're doing, and that is part of the narrative. That's not even a matter of rolling the raises or things like that. It's not until like once we've established where everyone is at and I want to push something forward that I then start kind of framing the scene, basically what you would say like a hard scene framing, where it's like, okay, this is literally a scene now. This is an important thing. How are you reacting to this thing?
Okay. Okay.
So I mean, there's at least a couple points in the night where I'm letting them go through there and do the things that they would naturally do, and that helps me know how and when to introduce those scenes that are going to push the plot forward, instead of just saying, boom, this is what you're doing right now.
Okay. Okay. So getting back to when you first got the book, do you have a physical copy or a PDF?
I have both now.
Both now. Okay, cool. So when you first, if you Kickstarted, no, you didn't back on Kickstarter,
No.
right? Okay, so you did. Did you get the PDF first or the physical copy?
I got the PDF first. One of the things was after I had read Rob Donahue's blog, I had realized both 7th Sea and Blades in the Dark seem like kind of challenging systems to analyze. So on my blog, I wanted to do a review of both of those systems. So I got the PDF for both of them. And I did not realize how much of a reaction I was going to have reading 7th Sea, because when I first started reading 7th Sea, my first impression was, man, I would not have organized it this way, because my brain always does that when I'm doing reviews. But as I got into the, okay, now the analytical part of me that's talking about how to structure this is gone. Now I'm paying attention to the setting stuff. And I'm like, I love the setting. I just really love the setting. And by the time I was done with that review, the funny thing is I didn't give it what would be like everyone should go out and buy this thing. I did give it kind of a qualified, like, if you like this type of thing, if you like narrative games, and if you like swashbuckling things, you should probably check it out. Here are things about it, because I don't like just saying, go out and get this. I rarely give that kind of recommendation. Yeah. But for me, when I finished reading it, I was like, I love this. This is really speaking to me.
It's worth knowing too, like the setting aside the interesting setting stuff too, like the art in the book is jaw-dropping, right?
Oh, yeah.
And tons of great stuff that makes you want to play, the kinds of heroes that they talk about in the game.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So when you got it, when did you first, like, what was the decision to run the game? Like,
what I did is after I did the review, I was like, these are really interesting mechanics. And we've talked about this before, but I did think that even though I love the mechanics at their core, I don't think they do the best job of explaining how to implement them. So I wanted to run a one-shot just to see how it went. And it was totally just intended to be a one-shot. We planned like an extra hour in there. So it was going to be a 4-hour session, but I planned an extra hour for people to make up their characters. I went online and I found a cheat sheet to give everybody for the quick primer for the rules. And I printed out, there's a thing in the Explorers Society, which we can touch on later, that's a thing. But it had like an index where, all of the different, what pages and everything you could find all of the different advantages and things on. So I had a thing to walk everyone through the character creation process. And we played through this first session, and everyone at the table after we played through this first session was just like, I'm not saying you have to, but if you were to run this full time, I would definitely be in. And it just really, because so many people were so positive, and it wasn't just, oh, I had fun with this group. It was like, I like the setting. I like the rules. I mean, and it was like, it went over so well. It was like, I guess I'm running this now.
So what prep did you do for the first session? Like, apart from getting the materials, like what sort of story prep or adventure prep did you do?
Oh my God. When I do one shots, I do a lot of cheat sheets to remind myself of rules and make sure you don't forget this. This is kind of important. But a lot of times when I'll do one shots of things like this, I don't do a lot of prep because I'm trying to react to what the players are making. Because I don't want to have this preconceived thought in my head where I'm like, okay, I want to show them this game, but I'm going to tell them they have to make these characters. I mean, to me, that would be like having a D&D game and saying, okay, you're all making wizards. It's like, I don't want to do that, because if the game gives you multiple people to use, I want to have, give them the opportunity to play with all those different toys and be from different countries and have different backgrounds. So I didn't plan a lot up front. The one thing that stuck out to me for some reason when I was reading through the book, I was thinking, man, if no one takes a port sorcerer from Montaigne, which is Montaigne sorcery, every nationality has a sorcery that is unique to that nationality. The French analog has a sorcery called port, which is basically they rip a hole in reality and can either like pull things from one place or transport themselves through it. And that was so evocative in my mind. It was like, I'm using that for a villain. If nobody takes that, I am using that for a villain, because that is so useful for a villain to have that ability that
Well, it's
that's
also
what
worth
I'm
saying,
doing.
like narratively in the game too, when they do open the portals between worlds, their
Yes.
hands are covered in blood because they're
Yes.
literally ripping a wound
Yes,
into
you actually create
space
a
and time.
wound in reality and it bleeds and it's horrible.
Yeah, it's very very cool. That's something that's carried over from first edition as well too. That's how Port worked
Yeah.
in that. So okay, that's interesting because a lot of times, like when I'm doing a one shot for things, and not by a lot of times, I mean almost every time, I will do pre-gens because I want the players to focus on learning the game mechanics first, and then to, if we decide we like the game, to go and for them to make, to have at least some idea of what numbers mean in that game, so they're
Yeah.
making characters. But I think that you're right that this is probably a better game to create characters because it's
Yeah.
so, story is such a big thing in this, in the game, both in terms of it's a narrative game and also in terms of how you get experience, right? Like how your characters advance.
Oh yeah, yeah. And yeah, we can touch on that later, but the experience system is really interesting in this. But yeah, it seems weird. Like I guess to some degree, I think you could hand somebody an elf wizard in it as a pre-gen for a D&D game, and somebody can kind of run with it. But when you're doing something like this, where it's kind of like this swashbuckling thing, and a lot of it is kind of, I think part of it is too, if you don't have anything in your head where you're thinking about like 17th century Germany, handing somebody an Ison character and saying this is what you're about is not necessarily the best
Yeah.
direction to go with that. Whereas if you already have in your head, oh, I know how to play a French thief from this period, and he's like this. It was a lot easier in this setting because people do have those tropes already kind of built into their heads.
Yeah, and it's, character generation in this too. It's worth maybe just touching on that. The way that you make a character, broadly speaking, is that you pick sort of two different kind of like archetypes,
Mhm.
and then you get certain things from each of those, and you have some decisions to make in terms of like bumping attributes and stuff like that, and your ethnicity, like or your
Yeah,
nationality, not ethnicity, your nationality plays into your stats as well. Um, and then when you're creating your character too, you choose a specific like story path to follow that
mhm.
is how your character advances, and it's
Right,
independent to your character, independent of whatever's going on in the broader campaign.
right. And that's just just as an example, one of my players, when he made his character, Felix is a Montaigne. He's an orphan and a criminal, which were his two backgrounds. Um, the Everything just kind of flows from that, where he's picking those things that gives him a certain number of skills. It tells him what advantages he starts with, and then he has a certain number of points that he assigns in addition to the ones that he has as his base there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean it's actually a really simple guided process, for how this works. The most complicated thing is probably when you're picking advantages, because advantages are much like feats and other systems, or stunts and other systems, where they interact with the rules in a very specific at a very specific point in a very specific way. So you kind of have to read through those in a little bit more depth. It's really easy to know I want to be sneaky, so I'll put another point and hide. It's not as easy to necessarily know what does reckless takedown do.
Yeah. One of the things I will give the game credit for too is that they don't try and they don't give like fancy names for no fucking reason to things.
Yeah.
Like your descriptions of, like, there are things. One of the things that why I bounce hard off of a lot of I should say, like, I enjoy the Cypher games, but one thing that drives me bananas about Numenera and the Strange is that I have to do translation to explain what the different character types are.
I don't want to hit on that too hard, but yes, that is so absolutely
And like,
true.
if what I'm going to do is tell my player that a glaive is effectively a fighter, just call it a fucking fighter or a warrior or whatever.
I know. I completely agree. I will tell you, having done reviews, like again, I like the game system, but
Yeah.
yeah, there are things that are just, there is kind of an obtuse naming convention thing that goes along there that I'm not as thrilled with. But I will say, if you read Unmasked, which is the 80s horror superheroes thing, that has the most plain language in it of any Cypher system game that I have seen, and it was really nice to read through that one, because it just felt like it's the setting. I'm not learning this other set of terms to make it unique. It's just like, even like the character types are things like, this is a mover. Okay. this is I forget what the brute is called, but there's just a very simple descriptive name for the guy that's going to beat on things. You know, it's much more intuitive in that game than any of the other ones that I have seen, and it was really nice to read through that.
Well, and that's, to take it back to 7C, that's one thing that is nice about the advantages, is that for the most part they do what it sounds like they do.
Yeah. Reckless takedown, just to you attack a brute squad, which is a bunch of minion people that aren't fully statted out. You take out the whole brute squad, and you take a dramatic wound. That's what reckless takedown does. So in order, you spend a hero point and you take a wound, and then you just take out 10 guys. Yeah. And reckless takedown, that's what it sounds like. You take a wound, but then you just took out a bunch of guys. So yeah, you're right. Yeah. It's very evocative of what it actually does.
Yeah. So what sort? It sounds like you had handed out the handouts to the players too. But what sort of conversation did you have about the mechanics or whatever before you guys sat down to actually play?
What part of what we were talking about is we often, because this is a group that I've come to talk a lot with them about other game systems and how this is similar to this game and this isn't similar to that game, and they have unfortunately had to deal with all of my reviewer brain kicking in when I'm looking at things. But one of the things that we were talking about was like, okay, these trait pools look a lot like, say, World of Darkness, but it's not quite like that, because you're not trying to determine a success. You're actually determining how much agency it's how much agency you have in the scene. Mm-hmm. So we basically were talking about things like that, and thankfully they had played in a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games with me before, so they were kind of used to this idea of, when you describe a thing, we'll define it by rules after you describe it. Mm-hmm. Because that's a big, Powered by the Apocalypse thing. The other thing that it was a lot like, we had played some different Fate and Fate Accelerated, and the approaches are very much like that. It's like, you're not just picking an approach and rolling that number, you're explaining why that approach makes sense for what you're doing.
Okay.
So it was kind of comparing it to some other game systems and, doing that kind of common language.
What Powered by the Apocalypse games had you guys played?
I've played a lot of Monster of the Week. Okay. I love Monster of the Week. And speaking of language and understanding something, I had Dungeon World. I like Dungeon World. I like it now. When I first read through it, because it is one of those first generation Powered by the Apocalypse games, there's a lot of things in it that just straight lift terms from Apocalypse World, and some of those terms make more sense in the context of a post-apocalyptic thing than it does in some of the other things. And when they're straight lit, I'm like, wow, some of this stuff, I don't know what that means. I don't understand that term, and you keep using that term. And even when they explained the term, it was like,
that's great, a Princess Bride reference.
Yeah, that's this thing I do not think it means. But yeah, Monster of the Week and actually Worldwide Wrestling RPG, which are both Powered by the Apocalypse games, those were the two that I read where I was like, oh, I get this now. I totally understand this, because they were a little bit more removed from that original language and more tailored to the type of story that it was telling, that it was like, oh, I get this. I understand. I understand what they meant by that now. We played a lot of both of those.
Before running 7C, we had played Blades in the Dark, because I fell hard for that game for about a 2-month period, and then I sort of got distracted by Conan, I think, when it came out. The Modiphius one. But we didn't have that same common sort of experience in language.
Yeah.
So it was hard to. I found that really hard to get my players to get into that mindset.
Right. And that's one of the things that I've actually been doing, like at our local convention, almost every year for our local convention for the last 3 years, I've been running every slot that I can. I run a different Powered by the Apocalypse game.
Okay.
So this is kind of exhausting, but also kind of awesome by the end of the weekend, because it's like,
oh, totally. Well, it's great having, like the more games you actually get a chance to run and play, and particularly run, I guess, just because you're required to engage the game material a lot more as a DM than you are as a player.
Yeah.
There's just more sides of the game you need to go through. So getting back to that first session, what's the coolest thing that happened in that first session?
I think one of the coolest things that happened right off the bat, we had a character who was a Surin, which is the Rascher analog, and he took big and strength of 10. So you can imagine what those do. Those are basically all things like when you do something that is good for you to be large and strong, you get extra, things for your approaches. And he was on a ship, and I'm explaining how, if you don't do this consequence, you're going to smash up against the rocks and you're going to take damage and all of this. And I was expecting something more along the lines of, oh, I grab the wheel and I force it back in place, or I'll grab these ropes and do this. He was like, is the mast breaking? And, that's one of those things where it's like, you run with stuff like that in a narrative story like that. It's like, yeah, sure, the mast is breaking. I run up and hold the mast up. And I was like, and the thing is, like, that it set a tone for his character. This is like a mythically strong guy. And it's like, I am great with that because that told me what he wanted out of the game. So I was like, that is great. So he basically holds this mast up and keeps the sails open so that they can actually coast onto the shore and not crash into the rocks. And I was like, that was awesome. That was great.
That's cool because it fits in with your previous DM style too, right? Of enabling players, right? So and it helps you as a player as a DM too to figure out things to give them the opportunity to be, that limelight, moment that players want. What changed about your understanding of the game after the first session?
I think I really started this one. Actually, I had one thing that didn't kick in until a few sessions in, because it was harder doing some of the dramatic scenes and realizing that I kind of needed to structure it where everyone had to do something with their raises to buy in, or else it was just like, we have a billion raises and there's like 4 things at stake here, and everything else is just people trying to come up with stuff on their own. And it was like, no, if everyone has an audience with Queen Elaine, they all need to introduce themselves. So that's going to be a raise from each of them. It's not just saying one person needs to introduce all of them, then you're good. Now, if somebody comes up with a really good, like I said with the trap, with getting all the people out of there, if somebody came up with a clever way of trying to ingratiate everybody in one shot, I might let them set up the opportunity for someone else to take. But otherwise, like, everybody's got to make a decent showing, when you first show up at court, or else that's just, giving everyone, free reign to do whatever they want to in the scene. And that kind of gives them a buy-in to say, this is almost like you putting your stake into being in this scene.
So I think I know the answer to this then, but from what you said, but is how much of that is like resource bleed in terms of like getting rid of those raises, and how much of it is keeping player engagement in those scenes? Because we've all had the players who grab their phones or just get distracted, grab a book or something like that when it's not featuring their character.
I think there's an equal part of that, because just because in this game system that resource is literally you just being able to declare something, being able to tell somebody, I need you to explain to me how you introduce yourself to court. That brings them into it. And everybody, once they realize, oh, if they're doing that, then I'm going to have to do that too. So then they start thinking, I'm going to have to come up with a good way to introduce myself to court, which, by the way, that was also awesome, is everyone introduced themselves to court except Felix, who was a thief. And he was like, can I spend a raise to just slink away so no one notices me while this audience is going on? I was like, yes, you can. You are still in the scene and nobody notices you.
That was the French urchin?
Yes. Yeah, that is the Montaigne orphan thief.
Yeah. Cool. So I think, I'm going back to our script here, and there's a lot of stuff we've covered here already in terms of prep and whatnot. So in terms of the structure, now that you got, it sounds like it wasn't a hard sell for you to transition that one shot into an overall campaign. What did you what was your thought process in terms of structuring the campaign from there? Like, were there story beats you wanted to hit, or was there a villain you wanted to explore, or you prepped to sort of lurk in the background, or?
What was interesting to me, I told you when I was reading through there, I was like, I have to have this Montaigne guy that, rips these holes in reality. And nobody took that form of sorcery. So I was like, that's awesome. That is great. So I'm going to have him do that. And also, just as a side note, if anybody, I don't want to do a deep dive into mechanics because you kind of have to read the book to read this, but a lot of sorcery is just spending a hero point or a danger point, which is what the GM has instead of hero points, to basically have narrative permission to say something. So like with that form of sorcery, you're spending that point to say that you ripped that hole in and stepped through and ended up somewhere else. So there's not like a lot of details to a lot of these sorceries. It's just kind of telling you what kind of narrative things you can spend a point on to say this is now true. There's a few that get a little bit more mechanical, like some of the glamour ones. You're counted as having like 5 more raises to see if you go first. So, it's basically because you're so dazzling, you get to go first, even though you have fewer things to do in the turn.
Yeah.
But I mean, for the most part, a lot of the sorcery is just being able to say, I pay this out, and now I'm going to declare this, which is in line with the sorcery that I am familiar with. So, but I wanted to have the Montaigne that could just rip these horrible, disgusting holes in reality and step through them. But what also happened is this. I have to tell this one. When we did the one shot, I told everyone, I was like, okay, it's going to be easier for my brain. I don't want to tell you what kind of characters to do, but if you're going to have everyone be not from like the same background, either have them all be from related countries that would make sense to be together, or you can have a bunch of different people from different countries that are all part of the same secret society. And what they did was they made people from a bunch of different countries that had no connection to each other whatsoever. Like, they start giving me their characters like, oh, so we completely discarded that. That's cool. I'm not going to tell you to make somebody else. But
that's great, too, because you guys did do a session 0.
Yeah.
They're all literally sitting around the fucking table together.
Yeah. I said this, and they still handed me like characters from all over the place. So so what I had to do in that first session was we actually had a montage of how everyone ended up in Carleone on the docks when Ashley got his commission to go out looking for this ghost ship. Mm-hmm. So they just all happened to be on the dock so that Ashley can say, I'm going to conscript you and you and you and you. And you're coming with me now. But it was funny because it forced me to be more creative, but I still remember it's like, okay, guys, either do this or do this. Yeah. And no. We're not doing either one of those. Yes. But one of the things about the ongoing thing with the villain, my first thought was to have the Montaigne sorcerer. But then one of my players made up an ice and monster hunter. And I was like, okay, I know they kind of would be against a sorcerer, but that's not a strong thing like hunting down a vampire or hunting down a werewolf or something like that. So I need to tie that in. So then all of a sudden it clicked to me. First off, the 7th sea is very vaguely defined in this. The 7th sea is like, and the best way I can describe it is the 7th sea is sort of like fantasy hyperspace. It's like this reality that exists underneath reality that is another sea where you can just end up in a different place, removed from geographically where you should be. And they don't, as far as I know, I have not run into a lot in the setting that goes into it in depth other than that it's a thing.
I think that they realized from first edition, eventually, like it started off with a bunch of different mysteries about like who the Sirnath, I think, or Sinreth,
the ancient society, yeah.
Yeah, and then they finally put a book out that actually told you everything. And like any one of those types of books, you're sort of like, oh, it's cool that we kind of know, but like the mystery's gone now. So I think they've learned that let's not find out Wolverine's backstory.
I was just about to say, it's like, I didn't want to know his name was James Howlett.
No, we never need to know this shit. I never need to find out those secrets. It's not going to whatever immediate payoff I'm going to get. So the 7th sea stuff maybe intentionally kept vague to.
Yeah. So what clicked with me is like, what if this guy figured out how to open these holes directly into the 7th sea, and there were all these things that got banished to the 7th sea because people, if they couldn't defeat them, they just figured we'll just shove them through this hole like in ages past, which can remain misty. And how'd they do it? Don't know. How long ago was it? I'm not telling you. You know, it's a thing that happened in the past. So I had these 3 siblings that were ghost pirates that got shoved into the 7th sea, and the sorcerer figured out a way to open up this thing, and in exchange for letting them free, they're all working for him now.
Ah, cool.
So he was still the master villain, but now we had a thing, we had the ghost pirate and the ghost ship for the monster hunter to be on board for. So the whole first session ended up being them hunting down this ghost ship and taking out this ghost pirate that had been preying on ships between that were sailing between Montaigne and the Glamour Isles.
With the one thing I also want to mention too, just for the viewers at home as well, that so the way that you get experience in 7th Sea 2nd edition is like you achieve story sort of milestones. Mm-hmm. And then the milestones can be set either by the GM as the sort of like the broad things that everybody gets a story point for, or they can be steps that you've set yourself. Like if you're playing a Knight of Avalon, you could specifically want to further your understanding of that and say, it'll take me 3 steps to get the 3 points I need to get my next point in sorcery, or whatever the cost is for it. And then the player will be the one who pursues that, because no one else is necessarily going to get a benefit from pursuing that.
Yeah. And like, for example, our duelist had a story where the mechanical thing he wanted was something that had to do with his dueling style. So the story that he made, you make a story and the number of steps are how many points that thing costs you to get. So the story award, or the story that he set up, was that he had to fight somebody from a different culture, in each of these different places. So in between doing
awesome.
Yeah, so in between doing all these other missions, he's like picking fights with, okay, I need to fight somebody from Asura, and now I need to fight somebody from Ison, and so he basically fought all these different people from these different cultures, which gave him a broader view, which is how you explain that he took this thing that played into his duelist background.
That's one of the things I think that interested me the most as a DM about the game, is the idea that it forces players, I mean, not forces, because they don't have to do that. They can get experience points from step points to spend on things from doing the general story stuff.
Yeah.
But I loved that there was a way for them to specifically pursue goals, which is great. Because I mean, we're gonna, as DMs, we're gonna eat up that story stuff, and it's like, absolutely, we're doing that. This is what our next thing's about.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I really like about this system is, I think at this point, because everyone has had to write those story awards, well, like you said, you can write it and just never do anything with it. But because everyone has kind of written those and we've kind of worked together to try and fill these things out, I feel like I know more about this party and their characters than I have a lot of other characters that I've run games for. Because someone constantly telling you who their character is when they're writing those story steps out.
Yeah, and from the player perspective too, it feels closer to a sandboxy type thing, where the players know why they're doing things.
Mm-hmm.
Because in a sandbox game, in a true sandbox game, the players, the world's out there to react, but the players have to figure out what options are out there and then make a plan as how they're going to do that stuff. For like a hex crawl type sandbox.
Oh yeah, and yeah. So for my overall arc, where I have the sorcerer that's got these 3 ghost pirates that are going around helping him control trade, that's the main plot. So the whole plot is going to be, let's find out more about these ghost pirates, let's hunt down the ghost pirates, let's get rid of them, then find out where this guy is at. That would have been fairly straightforward, but because of all the story goals that people had, Ashley, for each session where Ashley was in a different country, he's looking for somebody to fight.
Mm-hmm.
There is Ivan, our Asuran, that is the big strong guy, was an accidental deserter. He got on a Vestan ship instead of his ship that he was assigned to, and that's how he ended up in Carleone. Yeah. So his story award, he was trying to get the trustworthy trait, but his story award was basically trying to figure out how he could go back to Asura and explain to them how he got on the wrong ship and how he's really still a loyal Asuran.
That just, it gives you the cutscene of the guy looking at his ticket and looking at the ship and looking at the ticket and looking at the ship. I'm like, all right.
So, I mean, stuff like that, though, I mean, it provides a lot of extras so that you're not just driving straight into the plot. You have these player-driven things that you're throwing into these stories as well. Mm-hmm. Karen, our monster hunter, for our one-shot, this is one thing that shifted from the one-shot to when we turned it into a campaign. She had a Draconitsan sword, which in the setting, Draconitsan is this really rare metal that is really good for fighting sorcerers and monsters. Mm-hmm. And she wanted, if this was only going to be a one-shot, she wanted to play with that with a monster hunter. She wanted a monster hunter that had that. And so I gave it to her, and she even told me, at the end of that one-shot, she goes, if we play in a campaign, you can totally take this away from me. She's like, I just wanted it for this one-shot, so I let her have it for the one-shot. And then her story award was the very first session that we had of the regular campaign, that sword got stolen from her.
Awesome.
So we had this whole side plot, which is not related to the main, the main plot with the sorcerer and his ghost pirates and controlling trade. That was, there was a family of vampires in Ison that were going to use a Draconitsan relic to make themselves immune to Draconitsan.
Mm.
So they stole the sword, and the whole thing was her like going through her contacts in Die Ritter and tracking this thing down. And then it was basically our, because I structure things now, the way I run things, I tend to run them like television seasons. So like our mid-season climax was them going into Ison and tracking down these vampires and having the big fight with the vampire and Karen getting her sword back. And that was all her story. And it really did help it feel more like a television season, because in a television season, you don't want to have, even when you have an overarching plot, you don't want everything to go straight towards that plot.
Yeah.
So this provided that kind of side story that gave us more things to do than just driving straight to that plot. But it was also a good mid-season, pre-Christmas, here was our storyline, and this is where it culminated.
Yeah.
And that was another place where I gave them the story award, because I was like, this is your mid-season story award. I'm going to give you a 5-step award for going through, making it to the mid-season point for this season.
That's awesome. And it fits, I think, the feel. I think of like Eberron in the sense of like all these crazy things happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But this gives it a much better, a more organized way of structuring it, because there are specific player or player character incentives to getting involved with that. And the players themselves will not have to be reminded of why they're doing shit or why they're pursuing things, because they know. Cool. Well, that's great. So in terms of the division of time at the table, then are you able to give an estimate as to how much is spent on individual story stuff versus how much is spent on the broader plot?
I think it really varies, because every once in a while someone will write a story award that kind of glides along with the main story. Like Ashley's thing where he was fighting people in different countries, it took a little bit of extra time, but they were still going to those countries as part of this mission, getting more information about the Ghost Pirates. So that I mean, it added a little bit to it, but not a lot. But when they had to sidetrack back to Ison to get the sword, that literally took up like a session and a half that wasn't going back to the main plot that I had drawn out at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to put a finger on it directly. I mean, it probably varies from 25 to 50 to the whole damn session, depending on how it works out.
It's cool. And I guess it depends also on how involved your players are in pursuing those specific story goals too.
Mm-hmm.
If the players are really invested in whatever the broader story is, and they're still getting, benefits from that, then, that may be enough for them.
We have a player that, his whole character concept, he joined us after we did the one shot. And his whole character arc is that he was a noble from Avalon. He's not like a knight like Ashley is, where he's getting these commissions to go out and do these things for the Glamour Isles. He's just wanted to tag along, and his family told him learn something useful, because he's like the second son. So a lot of his things haven't been going off the beaten path. It's been like, I'm going to learn how to do the rigging on the ship. So his thing will be like, he just has like a brief scene where he's talking to some of the people on the ship, explaining how to actually run things on the ship. Or it's like, I'm going to inspire generosity in someone. And so a lot of his things run current, but they make sense for his character, because his character is like this wide-eyed guy that doesn't know how to do anything other than spend money, learning how to actually do things. Okay. So he's kind of along for the ride, but he's becoming gradually more and more useful the longer he's along for the ride, because he's just learning all of these extra skills.
It's cool that the game has sort of built-in mechanical limits as well too. So like the different skill pools and the attributes that we talked about, there's a global cap for all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about the game outpacing itself. So suddenly you're playing superheroes where you were playing,
right. And there does get to be a point to where like duelists, especially, eventually duelists are really super dangerous in combat. So it does get a little bit more challenging to throw things at them, but it is, I'd compare it probably more to, for example, Fantasy Flight Star Wars or 40K, which is weird because those are a little bit more simulationist, but it is one of those things where people's abilities tend to get broader. Like they may get better at certain things, but it's not the same exponential increase that like D&D does, where it's like, yes, you are definitely better at the end of the campaign at hitting somebody with a sword than you were at the beginning of the campaign, but it's not skipping up every single level. It's, you probably picked up a bunch of other skills around that at the same time.
So Cycling through to sort of some conclusions here for our discussion here. So having run 7C, how long have you run it now? 4 or 5 months?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It was last summer when I first ran the one
Oh,
shot,
so
and then it was a little bit, and we had the holiday scheduling, and there was a couple weeks when I was first getting ready to start the campaign. But yeah, ever since like the end of last summer, I've been running this. So
okay. So how does this? How would you say the game differs? Like, what's your approach to this game, and what does it play like differently at the table? For folks who are, say, like maybe more familiar with like D&D, right, which is like we discussed, 85% of the market.
it is definitely not a lot like D&D when it comes to how it does things. There's not like hard definitions of this is exactly what this does. It's like this is how you engage the mechanics to say that you did a thing, which is kind of hard to explain. I think you probably have more of a common language with this game if you have played Fate than anything else, because Fate has a lot of mechanics that deal with setting up the scene and what you can do in the scene and potentially failing so that later on you can be more awesome. So I think if you have a better idea of Fate, you might have a little bit more of an understanding of how this works.
Okay.
It's not to say it works exactly like Fate, but it has that kind of meta narrative idea of this is how the scene is structured, and the mechanics are more playing into the pacing of the scene than literally telling you that you succeeded or failed at something.
So let me see. So in D&D now, the new sort of way of explaining what you're doing in D&D from fifth edition, which I think follows back to it tracks back to all the previous editions, is those three pillars, right? The combat, role playing, and exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Of those, two of those don't really require a lot of mechanical intrusion. It's narrative. It's the conversation that's happening around the table between the players and the DM, and the planning and whatnot that's going to be happening, and role playing and interacting with the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Combat's really the one in D&D where the intrusion happens, and then it's a pretty heavy intrusion in the sense that you're going to be able to make some decisions as to what you do, and you will have some narrative input, but a lot of it is just the interplay of the system, to resolve what's actually happening. Am I right in thinking that that's different from what you'd be experiencing in?
Yes, because I think you can frame, because of the way the rules work, you can frame almost, if you were to say take that same like exploration, role playing, and combat and put that in 7C, you still have those things in the game, but you can frame them almost entirely with the exact same type of rules. So like if you want to, I've done this a couple times, I don't worry about like how long a trip takes. It's how arduous the trip is going to be and whether or not it requires them to roll a dramatic dramatic thing for it. And if we go into a dramatic scene for a trip, then I'm setting consequences for that, and it's going to be very similar to like an action scene where they're fighting someone, except there's not necessarily a villain for them to act against. So I'll be saying something like there's 60 points of damage, and if anyone's watching this and they've run 7C and they go 60 points, I have 6 players. So you do have to kind of, scale these things up a little bit, because 6 players is a lot. But basically what you're saying is the consequence is going to be, if nobody does things to make yourself and the crew safer and keep the ship out of danger, there's 60 points of danger at the end of this thing. You can either take that personally and say that like the rigging hit me in the face, or you can take the damage to the ship if you want to. It's up to you how you divide that damage, but if you don't mitigate those 60 points of damage somehow, then if we get to the end of this exchange, that damage is going to happen to someone somewhere. And that's the same type of thing that you would do in a combat scene. If you were saying the room is on fire, if you don't mitigate this fire damage, everyone's going to take 30 points of fire damage if you don't mitigate some of this damage by the end of the turn. So there's a lot more of the same framing mechanisms for the same type of thing.
You bring up an interesting point too, that I think where I fell down on this one is when you get too focused on the core, because the core mechanic is pretty fucking simple. Like you're just rolling a bunch of dice, adding tens, and then you're going from there. If you fall into the sort of non-narrative, and I mean like for players as well, where they're not describing things and they're not engaging with the environment and help to flesh out what's happening in that scene for the other players, for the DM, it really feels bare bones. Same way that AD&D or first second edition, where if all you're doing is just rolling attacks and hit and damage, it feels like there's no game there.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, I mean, it really is. The core rules, I love the core mechanics. I love how everything works in it, but they really do need more examples showing you, if you're gonna run a chase, here's an example. You don't have to run it this way, but here's how you could. I think the problem was, I don't think they wanted to provide the examples because they didn't want to tell people this is exactly how you do it. But by not providing the examples, they're not showing anything that someone can deviate from if they wanted to do it differently.
Yeah, and that's like the one time I've run the game, the real problem I had with it was the sea combat. In our scene, it ended up with a bunch of guys with I wanted to give them their own ship so they could do, get away, and they had infiltrated this, like, I think it was like they got into a prison and then like rescued some dude, and then they ran out, and then like the ship was like unleashing all its guns on people, and then there were other ships that were chasing them. And then we were like, well, there's no fucking rules for chase. I have no idea how to play this out. There's not even suggestions as to how to do this.
Yeah, and I mean, it could vary. I mean, if you want a chase to develop, but you didn't necessarily plan it beforehand, you could just say, I'm going to spend a raise to tell the crew to, unfurl the sails and, lean hard into the wind. And then narratively, there's distance there. And for the other ship to close on you, someone, your villain or your brute squad or whatever is going, well, actually brute squads can't do that. It's a whole other thing. But you would have to say they're spending this raise in order to close that gap.
Yeah.
And, you might determine, like, after a few, because that's one thing the rules also say is it's up to you when you're doing an action scene, it's up to you to determine it's done. So let's say you ended like the third scene with them not closing the gap, then you could just say you got away. But there's nothing in there that explains exactly how to structure a chase. Yeah. So even though you can do it that way, it may not be obvious that you could do it that way. The other thing that you could do is just set a consequence. If you don't spend a raise to get further away, then they're going to stay right on you. And then you could say, if you've widened this gap for three sessions, and you don't necessarily have to mechanically say it, but just you as a GM could say, okay, for 3 turns now, they've avoided the consequence of them closing on them, so we're done.
Yeah. And I think for my problem too is I have to check when the video was recorded, but I'm pretty sure that was when I was coming off of my Blades in the Dark kick, and I was too married to the idea of the clock.
Yeah.
Because for those unfamiliar with Blades in the Dark, one of the ways that you track progress on things, on anything you're doing, if it can't be done in one sort of go, is you have a clock. You just draw a little pie chart and you fill in things as things get done. So my natural inclination was to do that. And I'm not sure it worked okay for the scene, but I think my frustration with the system carried over to the players, so they didn't enjoy it as much when I'm like, fuck this system, Yeah. It's amazing how that works out.
Yeah, I totally understand that. But yeah, and by the way, the clocks are an awesome thing from Blades in the Dark, and someday when I play more than one session and I've gotten a chance to run it, I would love to talk to you about Blades in the Dark again, because I really like that. It's just I reading both of them, 7th Sea edged it out just because the setting, I just fell in love with the setting.
For sure.
But either one of those, it was very close which one I was going to run that one shot for. And 7th Sea edged it out. I could have been doing this whole thing of Blades in the Dark this time instead of this, depending on how things worked out there.
Yeah. It is like it's a game that I need, I want to go back to, but I want to go back and run a campaign for it. That's where it's really going to shine. But anyway, but setting that aside for another conversation, for 7th Sea then, what's something that's happened in your games of 7th Sea that you would not have seen in other games?
I think one of the big things that's happened is I have not had a lot of games where romance played any part of the narrative. And because there are multiple things, like the setting in general, because it's a swashbuckling setting, that just sticks in people's minds where that's a thing. So right off the bat in the one shot, Ashley starts hitting on the captain of the ship that helped them track down the ghost ship before they had their own ship. And he was just like, I'd love to talk to you over dinner about how we accomplish this mission. And I was like, you know what? It's a one shot and this is Ashley's personality. So I was like, you have dinner with the captain and she invites you back to her cabin and we fade to black. And I've rarely had that actually come up. Like in D&D, I've had people get married and things like that, but it's not nearly as natural. It's just something that happens. And the other thing is, there was a villain that they captured instead of killing her, because that is bad in this game. And they captured her, and they didn't know what to do with her because they just kept carrying her around. So they decided to chain her to Yvonne, and they started a redemption arc for her. And part of that redemption arc was that her and Yvonne became a couple. And it just happened so naturally, and it was actually ended up being like part of the story step.
Yeah.
That it's part of the genre, but it's happened so much more naturally in this game than I've seen in any other game that I've run. Just the session we ran last night, we played side characters that they had met before, just for a one shot to give more of that character's backstory. So she assembled this crew to go clear her name from something that had happened 5 years ago. And two of the characters ended up that they had crossed paths with in the past ended up starting to flirt with each other. So we kind of like did this thing where those two are probably going to be a couple. But the other thing that was even funnier about that was the one guy has a grudge against Ashley, our regular duelist. And one of Ashley's moves is the Aldana's Ruse, which is basically you dance around somebody, and then when you hit them later, you do more damage because you completely distracted them by dancing around them. The female duelist has that same move. So she is enamored of the one duelist because he is this strapping, grim, swordsman. And he is fascinated with her because she knows Aldana's Ruse, and she's going to learn it from her so he can go back and challenge Ashley again. And that was that is so like in this type of setting that would make perfect sense, but it just emerged naturally from all of these elements coming together, and it was great.
That's, I think, probably one of the neatest thing. Like, I haven't seen it play because I've only run the game once, but the promise of this game is that alchemy of the interaction between what you've got planned for the campaign, and because every player is thinking of their story beats, you can find those unintended wonderful story things that you're like, I would never have come up with this myself.
Yeah.
And that can happen in any game, but if you've got players who are really invested in role-playing their characters, but because this game forces them to do that and think that shit through, that it really allows for that to happen more often, probably.
Oh, it was great because, I mean, it was sort of, we did kind of a one-shot last night, but it's related to the main campaign because it was all NPCs that they had interacted with that they were playing.
Yeah.
But what was awesome about this was like a one-shot thing. I was like, hey guys, would you mind doing this to fill in some of this backstory for one session? And they're like, yeah, that's great. Would we still get some kind of reward? It's like, yeah, you'll get a story reward from them playing through the story. You just won't be advancing your character story. Like, oh, that's great then.
Yeah.
And at the end of this, I said, these guys get the story award too. And they're actually like leveling up these characters that are just one-shot characters. Like, someday we might play them again. And they all had fun playing these characters that were just awesome. Random people that they had run into over the course of the campaign. So that was great. I do think one thing that this game has really, I think the thing that you're going to have to do if you're going to get anything out of it, though, is you need to get really comfortable with hard framing scenes.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Basically, once you have determined that something's going to be a dramatic scene or an action scene, you need to really be able to say, the stakes are this. So once this ends, the scene is over. And part of it is the mechanics of having interesting opportunities for them to be able to take advantage of, and having a consequence at the end of the thing that they're actually working towards. I've run a couple combats where they're just fighting in the action scene and there's not really much of a consequence other than just that they're fighting people. And those didn't go badly, but by and large, it's a lot more interesting if there is a consequence at the end too, because it makes them feel like it is the best analogy I can say. And I will still say I love all three of the original movies. It reminds me of the Pirates of the Caribbean thing when they're in the whirlwind and they're up in the rigging fighting as the two ships are leaning towards each other as they're going in the whirlwind. In other words, it's not the fight. The fight can be interesting, but it's the fight on two ships in the rigging while there's a storm going on in a whirlwind.
Yeah.
It's having all of that extra stuff going on that really keeps you engaged and also gives you an idea of other things you may want to do. Because you may say something like, I want to throw someone into the whirlpool instead of just stabbing them.
Yeah.
And it gives you so much more like, I'm just going to kick this guy in the face and knock him off into the whirlpool instead of I'm just going to stab him. It gives you a lot more of that wider narrative stuff. But it really does require, the rules don't do a lot of examples, and it should, and you really need to hard frame a lot of those scenes a lot more to get the most out of this.
Okay, that transitions well into my next question, or next thing I want you to talk about is the house rules that you use. Because you mentioned earlier the Explorers League, so maybe you could talk about some, because there's a lot of good material that's been produced by the fans.
The one of the things that's really cool, and I think everybody has had over the years, they've had things that they let people publish, and this kind of started with the open game license with 3.5, but even way back, I know Judges Guild was allowed to do some D&D stuff, and then TSR got more and more of a pain. So there's been this long history of people that don't publish the game putting out stuff for the game. But the Explorers, the Explorer Society is basically very much like if you're used to the DM's Guild for D&D, where you literally are said, if you sell this through this site on RPG Now, you can put out stuff for our game. You know, you have to follow a certain template for it and, you know, put in certain wording, but you can put out stuff for that. And there have been some things there that I think do a much better job of explaining examples and how to frame things without necessarily completely breaking the rules or going, you know, adding too much extra stuff to them. Some of the things that I thought were really useful, Tom Harrison has put out the cards on the table, which is really great. It's the primary thing about the thing is just that you have these cards that can show consequences or you know, for the end of the round or opportunities, and you can just display these things out there. So like if you're going to say that you have to mitigate 30 points of damage, you can put out these cards to show how many points of damage they need to get rid of, and it's a visual representation that reminds people. But the other thing about that product beyond the cards is he's got examples of different types of scenes and what the opportunities and consequences for those scenes would be. And those are great to read through to give you an idea of how to frame these things.
Is Tom the guy who did the expanded ship rules as well?
Rob Donahue did an expanded ship rules. I don't know if Tom did as well.
Someone I picked up a while ago, a PDF that had expanded ship rules in it, and I found that to be quite helpful.
Yeah, I know that was one of the first things that Rob Donahue had done after he had done all of his analysis on his blog. He put those out too, so that was kind of neat. The other thing that Tom Harrison also did cut to the chase, which is a whole thing just on how to frame chases. Which that was really nice. I haven't used exactly those rules, but just reading through them has definitely helped me to think these are how you need to have those stakes in there to make a chase interesting and to, you know, to give some pacing to it. Evan Perlman just put out a thing called The Good Fight, which is not really new rules, but it is analyzing some of the math behind fights, like how many raises you can expect someone to have. So if you really want something to be interesting, maybe plan for this number of opportunities in a fight and all those sorts of things. And it's kind of a neat meta-analysis of how combat plays out. So those are some of the things that were on there. I haven't done a lot of house rules just basically saying this or that, but a lot of the way the narrative works in this, one GM is not going to interpret things exactly the same way as somebody else. I had a player that was trying, there's some advantages that are very obviously social advantages where it's like, I'm going to spend this and they're not going to consider me a threat, and they've tried to do that in the middle of a fight, and I've kind of run with it, but then I've gone back through later and said, I think once somebody draws steel, that's, you know, even if that person hasn't drawn steel yet, everyone knows it's a fight, you know. So I've had to make some rulings like that where it's not clear in the rules, but I think the intent is that. I see one thing
in the summary you mentioned about the guns as well too. Maybe you could describe just how guns work differently in this.
In general, I don't mind how guns work, but basically, you have a number of wounds and you have a number of dramatic wounds. And after you take a certain number of wounds, you take a dramatic wound. And once you take all your dramatic wounds, you're out of the scene. The way guns work is no matter how many regular wounds you take, you will take a dramatic wound. So let's say, you know, you don't take 5 wounds, somebody just spends 1 raise to shoot you, you still took 1 dramatic wound. So literally to take you out of a fight, if somebody had 4 guns ready, they could spend 4 raises and take anyone out of a fight. and you can't really and the way the rules are framed, you cannot mitigate damage from a firearm.
Yeah.
So once somebody uses a gun, you take that dramatic wound.
I saw you had posted something on the 7th Google Plus community too about that, about a player who had taken that approach to basically take out villains in one round.
And there was actually there's a historical precedence, because Blackbeard was famous for having a brace of 6 pistols on him.
Yeah.
So it's hard to even say, no, you shouldn't do that, because that's not genre appropriate, except for this one guy that's super famous for it. So what it becomes is, I've had to work through trying to make things more interesting and giving people more to do, so they can't just spend those 4 raises and take somebody out.
Yeah.
I get the intent behind the thing, but I don't have a fully developed idea on what I want to do about it yet. But it's one of those things that the more I watch the genre, even in the genre, guns are more dangerous than swords in the genre, but guns are not a be-all, win-all. It's usually like a final shot when somebody's about to stab somebody else. And the number of times, if you watch any kind of swashbuckling media where guns get used, if you see the number of times somebody just happened to have a Bible or a flask or something that stopped a bullet, I'm not sure you can't get rid of damage from guns in the genre. And it's one thing that I've really been kind of analyzing. I'm not sure how I want to do it, because I don't want to just toss rules out, because I hate doing that. I try and play in the rules as much as possible, unless they just don't work.
Yeah.
But
well, you don't want to take away, I've used it as an example on my in my channel before, but I basically used to when I was playing or running 4th edition D&D quite a bit. I had a couple of levels where, because I had players who played through from about 6th level up to about 13th or 14th. And what was inevitably happening is they would end up developing these incredibly effective combo techniques with their characters. And then what I was doing is, started using monsters that specifically either they would be able to defeat that, or it wouldn't be effective against them. And then what players would inevitably do is just change away from that, from what they had built. And I realized what I was doing is just taking away their fun.
So I don't want to say, no, that's not a thing anymore. I was terrible. I did have one fight where undead crabs swarmed the guy and just oozed all over his guns. Your guns are now found. But I also
impressive DM bullshittery.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I spent danger points for it, so I spent some of my GM resources, but but at the same time, he still had a gun that I didn't say they got all of your guns. It's just all of them in the brace there. So once you shoot the one that you have on your back, then the rest of these you're going to have to clean out before you can shoot again. And I even he went over to one of our other characters and yanked his guns out of his holsters and fired those, and I didn't have a problem with that. It's less about him doing it and more making sure there's some dramatic storytelling, because if the storytelling is just I shoot, I pull the next 2, I shoot, I pull the next 2, I shoot, that's not really dramatic storytelling. That's just somebody whipping out a bunch of guns and shooting. Whereas, having to pull out the guns from somebody else's things and shooting those, and then trying to desperately clean the undead crab gunk out of your
and it's worth noting too, those are the only kinds of weapons that are treated as having any kind of special rules in the game.
Yeah. Everything else, if you punch somebody or you stab them with a 2-handed sword, there's no difference other than narratively certain dueling styles. You're required to have a certain type of weapon to use that dueling style. But it's just as far as spending raises to do damage to somebody, you could punch somebody or stab them with a knife, and it's the same thing, because it is trying to emulate that genre where, literally if Elizabeth Swann punches somebody in Pirates of the Caribbean, if it's not an important villain, she probably takes them out just like if she cut them with a sword. Yeah. I mean, that really is genre appropriate, but
and that's the thing. The game is attempting to emulate the source material, not to play the way things would work in reality.
Right.
So what have you learned from running 7th Sea 2nd edition that you would bring to other games?
I think learning how to hard frame things is actually still a good thing. And by hard frame, I don't necessarily mean like the same thing where you're saying you have this many opportunities and this many consequences, but it's the idea of always keeping in mind that a scene really needs to have some stakes. Like, you're not just fighting people. It's like, why are you fighting them? Under what circumstances does this fight end? Under why? How do you know for sure you've gone past that point of no return where a fight is going to start?
Yeah.
Having those ideas about that hard framing is a good thing to carry over into any game. And I actually think doing this has actually made running my Dresden Files game better, because it's been helping me to hard frame these things in Fate a little bit better, even though I know that's a thing that you need to do in Fate. So,
you know, and it's worth like, I guess, like to try and rephrase what you said there too. It's, you know, if you're considering why you're doing that scene, that helps you figure out whether it's necessary as well.
mm-hmm.
You know, like I'm right now in the middle of a dungeon crawl in my Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign, and I hate running dungeon crawls. Like, it's one of the things that it's killed more campaigns of mine than anything else, because I get so fucking bored with them.
I am right there with you. I understand that.
But the interesting thing that, but because I know I hate them, and I don't want to have my players hate them, I've been trying to have every single room has got something that's dynamic in it, like to sort of think of what appealed about old school dungeon crawls, and it's because they had these weirdo things happening in every room, right? You know,
it is the points of interest, not really just the idea of going through the thing.
Totally. And that's an interesting way of thinking of it too, is just like, okay, well, what is, if I need to make this interesting and to distinguish itself from another, like the goal shouldn't just be everything's dead, it should be something else. You know, like my session last night, we ended up having, there were 2 goblins who made runners for 2 different areas, and both of places would have resulted in reinforcements. And the players had learned that the hard way before, so it became you know, there was more to do in the session than just kill everything dead. It was like, fuck, catch that goblin before it gets...
Oh yeah, definitely. You know, and it's weird because there are times when I've run things in D&D, I do just kind of want to have a fight, but even having some idea of the Frost Giant hates these guys because of X. Even though it still boils down to just having a fight, you know, if they talk to the Frost Giant now, because you've thought of, oh, they hate him because of X, at least you have some dialogue for him now.
Yeah.
It's not, even though it is a fight, he can say, you know, the dwarves killed my clan at, you know, the ridge of blah, 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 blah. And there's texture there. It's not just giants fight you because they are giants. You know, it's, you know, yeah, he's a big surly giant, but he also has an axe to grind. Specifically, he has a real axe to grind, you know, because of this thing. And it does kind of keep that in mind there, where it's like, even if the stakes are just he wants to kill you and you don't want to die, you know, it starts reminding you that at least do that much work to where you're thinking about it, not just on autopilot.
Yeah. So who'd you recommend the game for? Like, who do you think, having, I know you said at your reviews, you don't want to necessarily, you know, it was a qualified thing. Mm-hmm. Having played through it now for several months, who's this game for? Who do you think would really respond to this? I
hesitate to say that any game is not somebody's first game. I'm not sure that this would be an introductory game.
I totally agree with that.
Especially for a GM. I actually think you could probably get away with this being the first game someone plays, but I don't think this should be the first game that you try and GM. I think that it's something you have to at least get an idea of, you know, if somebody played a lot of Fate and then moved to this, I think they could handle it, because they have that idea of the scene framing and having titles for things for a scene and things like that. Mm-hmm. It's definitely like, I think somebody could do it as a beginner game as a player, not as a GM. I wouldn't recommend this as your first game as a GM. I think if you are very happy and comfortable with more simulationist games, I don't think this is going to scratch an itch for you. But as a caveat, I would say you might want to take this setting information and then get something like the what am I trying to say? It's the Savage Worlds, the Pirates of the Spanish Main, or what is the fantasy?
Let's go. There's a Regime Diabolique. That was
there was a specific ocean-going one that had supernatural elements.
Savage Worlds?
Yeah.
50 Fathoms.
Yeah, 50 Fathoms. I think you could take the rules for 50 Fathoms and use this setting.
Mm.
And I think that might be more satisfying for somebody that wants something a little more crunchy. And that's not to say Savage World is simulationist, but I think it's more simulationist than...
Absolutely.
Than this
it plays more like a traditional game then. It's a cinematic traditional game. Mm-hmm. I'll throw it to, you know, with, now that we've got the Freeport companion out for it too, I think you could use Savage Shadow the Demon Lord.
Oh yeah,
as well. It would give it you'd have to play up the fortune points optional rules out of forbidden rules, but
yeah, because you want people doing heroic stupid things that don't necessarily screw them over, but yeah.
Totally. And also, I mean, the body count for early levels in Shadow the Demon Lord can be pretty high.
Yeah, that doesn't quite seem as swashbucklery. Or aha, I swung across the deck and then I broke my leg and they slit my throat.
Yeah. We talked earlier about this being a whitewashed sort of historical thing. That would be closer to the reality of like, hey, and now you've got scurvy.
It is so funny because one of the things that I do to prep games, and I don't mean to go off on another tangent here, but one of the things that I do to prep games a lot of times is consume media that has to do with it.
Yeah.
And what's really funny is I started watching Black Sails. Black Sails is great for getting in the pirate mindset. It is not great for getting in the swashbuckler mindset, because in Black Sails it's like, oh, the thing gave out on the ship and it just crushed a dude. Or, hey, that just stabbed a guy and it got infected and he died. Because it's much more of a gritty pirate thing than it is a swashbuckling pirate.
Well, that's the thing. Like, this game does do a good job of making it a fun. There's fun reasons, and you ignore the ugly reality of piracy.
Yeah, yeah. There's a whole section in Pirate Nations that goes into that, where it's like, we're playing up the romanticized notion of pirates. Yeah. Real world pirates, we're kind of scum. And there's a whole section in Pirate Nations that goes into that, where it's like, think of fantasy pirates and people that are sort of like, I just want to live free and I don't want to hurt anyone unless I have to. Don't think of real pirates.
So if a DM does decide to take the dive into this, what's something that they have to try with this game?
I think, oh man, you have to have something where a bunch of different options are going off at once. So like, like one of the examples I came up with is, having someone get kidnapped in the middle of a fight. Like, you're already fighting, but then somebody gets kidnapped, and then having someone else come up and steal something from you, so that you're having to deal with things, and it's dynamic, because that's one of those things that it's harder to do in a D20 system. Because once you've established this thing and everyone rolls initiative, if you then suddenly say, this guy just stole a thing and ran away from you, you're like, what did he roll? How many spaces can he move? But in this, you can just literally say, one of the brute squad just split off and took your guns, and you can say, crap, I need those back, or I need to kill this guy first, or they just grabbed, this merchant that has the treasure map, and they just ran back up their thing. It's like, I really want to fight this guy, but I need to go up there. So I think having that multi-tier thing where multiple things are going on, that's where the system really shines. So you need to look at those things where multiple things are going to go on at one time, where it's not just a head-on fight. You're not going to see all of the swashbuckliness unless you have that multiple tiers of things going on at one time.
And even from a mechanical perspective too, I think that helps people figure out what they're going to do with their raises, rather than just dump them all into damage in a combat scene.
Oh yeah, because it's really funny, because I just did a review for something that seems unrelated, but I just did a review for the Sentinel Comics starter kit.
Yeah. I read it, actually.
Yeah, and they specifically mentioned in there an encounter design. I love how they frame adventures and scenes in the Sentinel Comics thing, because they're very explicit on, this is what this scene is about. This is what you want to accomplish. And one of the things that they say when you build a scene is, give people more options than they can possibly resolve.
Give me 1 second. I'll be right back. I'm just gonna, sorry. Oy.
So if anyone keeps watching this, I know this is Kevin's stream, but I'll try and entertain you until he gets back. I have no idea how I'll entertain you, but I just don't want there to be dead air for while he's gone. Any minute now, he'll be back. And when he gets back, you'll be able to listen to his dulcet tones again. And at some point, I'll be able to see his reaction to me trying to vamp while he's gone, trying to keep us from having dead air. At this point, I'll refrain from singing, even though that was my first impulse, because I'm terrible at singing. Any minute now, Kevin will be back, and then everything will start just falling into place again. Should be a lot of fun, because Kevin is awesome. Kevin's a lot of fun to listen to. I know, I've listened to Kevin a lot. Someday I'm even going to run a game with Kevin in it again at some point in time, because I had that much fun running with Kevin in our Shadow of the Demon Lord game, which you can see on Jared Rascher's YouTube channel.
Oi. Sorry about that.
At some point, I want to see your reaction to me vamping for that, that time period, trying to kill the dead air there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'll look forward to. Sorry, I'll look forward to seeing that afterwards. Sorry. I heard the dog. It was there's the distinctive sounds of thumping that you're like, that's not a good.
Yeah. There's just good thing. There's things where either you hear the dog making a noise where you know it's a problem, or you suddenly don't hear the dog making a noise and you're like, oh, that's not good.
Yeah, this cannot end well. So I'm very sorry for that, Jared. I will look forward to hearing what the. Sorry, when I ducked out there to deal with a canine emergency, you were talking about the Sentinel, Silver Sentinels.
Oh, the Sentinel Comics role-playing game. They talk about in that when you create scenes in that, you know, it's important to know why the scene is happening and what people should be getting out of it. But they also say that you should design a scene to where there's more things in it that somebody might want to accomplish than they actually can accomplish. And I actually think that advice would have been great for explaining how to frame scenes in 7th Sea. Because the way it works in the Sentinel Comics game is there's actually a track. And when you hit the end of that track, the scene is over. And if you don't accomplish everything, then you just didn't accomplish it. So in other words, if there's a bomb you need to disarm and there's a supervillain, you know, if you spend your time disarming the bomb, you may not be able to, you know, and you get to the end of the track, the GM can just say, and they escaped. Because the scene has an ending to it. And since it is discretionary up to the GM to say this action scene is over, I think you could actually do some things like that in this, where you're just like, you know, this is going for 3 scenes or for three rounds, and when we get to the end of that, that's whatever we accomplish. That's kind of like what I was saying with the chase scene, how to frame that. I think it needed more of that, because I think that advice is pretty applicable to 7th Sea. It's just not here in the actual rules. Yeah, and it's you know, like the one thing that like, because it was out around the same time as well, or at least it was in the sort of gaming zeitgeist at the same time. I think of Blades in the Dark. And Blades in the Dark is an incredibly elegant way of structuring conflict and scenes and whatnot, and making it so there's an interesting game that's going on, as well as the narrative and whatever else. And I think that if this game had a little bit more in terms of concrete suggestions as to how to structure some of the games. Yeah, I definitely agree. There's even things, one of the things that I noticed that I really liked, because it's a really versatile thing, but you wouldn't necessarily know to do it from reading the rules. If you get heroes and villains, and I know you had talked about heroes and villains, and there weren't really a lot of new rules in it, but if you look at the examples of how they built some people, there's an NPC who doesn't feel pain. And they gave them the monstrous trait of chitinous, which is something that a monster with a heavy shell would have, where you spend a danger point and they ignore damage. Is this the Johann Snow character? I can't remember for sure. Okay. I just remember that I read that and it was like, that is really cool. But that's not something they never really say. Like, even if somebody's not a monster, you can give them these monstrous traits, but you can. And that is something that it would be so simple to be able to say. And what I was thinking, it's not even that, but like armor isn't a big thing in the setting, because you kind of move beyond that. But every once in a while you will see, especially like, you know, if you picture like an Ison mercenary, sometimes you still picture them wearing the big heavy armor, and it would be really easy to say they have that trait, even though it's not anywhere else in the rules, and just say like, I'm going to spend a danger point, and he ignored it because it just hit that big heavy plate that he's wearing. You know, because that's a thing that you could do. You could model that using the monster rules, but nowhere in the rules does it say, you know what, these are primarily for monsters, but you could just, you know, tack these onto other things. Well, if they'd reframe them as being adversary rules, right, like that would be plenty, or villain rules, I guess, is appropriate for the you just flavor it more supernatural for a supernatural thing, or and that's another thing with the monsters. When you get into the Crescent Empire, has a bunch of monster traits that are just really neat, because there's some that are just basically giving you permission to say, if you, and it's not spelled out anywhere in the main rules, but it just says, if you don't have the right item, you can't harm this thing. And even though that's a common monster trope, that's not really spelled out in the core rules, but it's something they spell out in some of the expansion books. And it's like, man, that is because you can't, if you're fighting a werewolf and you do not have silver, you cannot harm it. That is a hard dead stop. You know, if you're fighting a werewolf from Ison, the way they have them statted out, you cannot harm them without, even Drakenitsan does not harm a werewolf
Mm-hmm.
But because it's not spelled out in the core rules, you don't realize that you can do stuff like that with the rules until you get to some of these explanations in the expansion books. And then it's not really presented as rules. It's just a thing that they mention about this one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So if you run into a werewolf and you don't have silver, you're actually spending those raises instead to maybe try and throw a net around the thing and hold it down so that it can't bite anyone, instead of actually harming it, trying to find some way to incapacitate it until you can come back with something that you could kill it with, you know?
That's one thing I'll give for the game as well, is one of the things I found attractive as a DM for it was how fucking easy it was to come up with monsters and adversaries.
Oh yeah, I love that. I've actually kind of had a little bit more fun with the monsters, and I'm glad that I had a supernatural frame to this.
Yeah.
Because until I started realizing that they kind of fudge the rules a little to throw monstrous traits onto regular things, it was a little bit more fun to build monsters just by throwing these traits on something.
Totally. Like you can fit all of the you can fit an entire monster description on a tiny post-it.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's great. Also, we're coming up on our penultimate session for this season, which I've told them I may run other seasons, but I kind of want to break, at the end of this season to do something else, and then we might go back to these characters. But we're coming up to the second to last thing, and the way we closed the last session was there's a Greece and there is a vaguely Greek pantheon. So I had one of the last things that their Montaigne sorcerer did, because all of his plans are falling apart, is he ripped open this portal to the Seventh Sea, and Scylla came through. Nice. So there's this gigantic, cursed sea nymph with all of these tentacles and wolf heads all over her, that is just this massive colossal monster now that they have to deal with, because, and it's not going to take much to stat her up, really. I mean,
yeah, and that's the joy, is that it does, you get really interesting, compelling characters. Like character creation, this is, to me, it reminded me of why I loved character creation in the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game.
I've played that, and it does remind me a lot of that, because you do that whole, like, you take this plus this, and that's your core.
Well, and then like we played Iron Kingdoms, or I ran Iron Kingdoms for about 2.5 years as well too. Like in the interim between when 4th edition sort of died out and before D&D Next started playing, we played that as the interim. And what we sort of did as a default was we would pick one profession as what they're doing now, and one profession as sort of their backstory. So if you took that same approach for 7th Sea, you could, it's a really easy way to understand who your character is,
Oh,
former pirate who's now a noble, or former noble who's now a whatever.
And the interesting thing about it is, even though they've released new books, and some of those books explain the rules a little bit better than the core book did, I think it's not quite like the Splat book thing, but there are more backgrounds in some of these things. Like when you do the Nations of Thea books, and they go into the specific section on Ison, there's even more backgrounds that have to do with Ison, for example. And I think that even makes it better, because it's not a thing like with a lot of Splat book things where it's like, oh, these things are clearly better. It's just literally a different background that is thematically in keeping with that thing, that just makes sense and just expands options and backstory and things like that.
Yeah. No, the core book, in terms of character creation and DM resources to create adversaries, there's tons and tons of material in there. There's because of the amount of combos you can have, you could be very satisfied. The lack of description, like you may require some assistance to figure out mechanically what you're going to do with the game, but the character creation and monster creation certainly is not lacking in that.
Yeah. I actually really, I mean, this is just my armchair thing. If I were going to restructure and do something different with that core book, I would have put the character creation right up front, because I think it's really weird to talk about, this is a swashbuckling game that you can get into really fast, and now we're going to spend 50% of the book telling you about the setting and not the game system.
Yeah. There's a game that came out recently called Blood and Bone that's sort of, it's, 80% is fluff, and then there's a little bit of crunch in it as well. And this game, 7th Sea feels for kind of like that, where it's a really fucking awesome setting that has a game appended to it.
Yeah, and I think you could have probably trimmed at least a page out of each of the nation descriptions in the core book, because it's covered elsewhere and they kind of hit the same notes in other places. I think you could have trimmed a page out of each of the nation descriptions and tacked that on as explaining better how to frame scenes, and it would have been a better core product. Like, here is an example of a chase. Here is an example of, you know, of a scene where you have rising tensions, like a fire that's about to collapse something. Even though they give a short example of that, having it more strictly framed out, like this is exactly how you would do it, I think would have been, and you could have taken those pages, like those whatever, you know, 10 pages that you trimmed out of the setting thing and put there to frame the scenes, it would have made the core book a much stronger product.
Yeah. There's in Heroes and Villains, there's that like 2-page description of what, like a seen by or raised by a raise description of what a fight with a villain is like. And that really helped me when I was prepping to figure out what the hell, like how that actually would play out at the table.
Oh yeah, and there's even things that end up being applicable to other things that are framed of, like in the Crescent Empire. There's a whole thing on poetry battles, whereas like somebody is basically, which was actually a thing, which is awesome, which means rap battles actually go back to at least. But the thing is, you can use those exact same rules just for two people insulting each other at court to see who has the upper hand. And that's great stuff that is framed in some of the later books that I'm not saying necessarily that should have been in the core book, but it's examples of how to do other things with the same core mechanic that is great, that when you invest in it a little bit, you actually get a broader idea of like, oh, I could use the rules to do that. That is awesome, you know?
Yeah. So as a last thing to talk, or last topic to talk about, we spent the last like almost 3 hours talking about, seeing this from a DM's perspective. So now a clever villain has tricked you onto the other side of the screen. Who is the character that you would want to play in this game, and what would you want to do with that character in the game?
So I thought of this, like, whenever I play in games, I often play a support role, like when I play something like D&D, when I finally get to play. But this is not a good game to be in a support role. So my other mode, when I'm not playing support mode because I'm normally a GM, is to just make a batshit crazy character.
Nice.
So what I was thinking is, because I haven't seen a lot of people do this background yet, I would have somebody from the Crescent Empire that was a member of the Brotherhood of the Coast, which is the good pirates in the setting that have this kind of agreement about who will raid and who we won't raid. So that's my core concept. But my other concept is there's an advantage called the Devil's Due, where there is the character that is basically the Davy Jones of this setting, which is like the supernatural pirate guy that just haunts the oceans. And there is an advantage where you sacrificed a body part and you get this magical artifact that just does a thing. And it works kind of like sorcery, where it's just you spend a hero point and it does this thing in the circumstance. But I would totally do that just to have that weird haunted background of, yeah, I cut off one of my ears to get this thing. And the fun would be trying to figure out what exactly I want the thing to do. But I would totally have somebody that was just the swashbuckling pirate that is kind of a good person, but has this tie to this dark, creepy thing and has this artifact that just does this thing every once in a while because I sacrificed part of myself to Davy Jones. Because I read that advantage and that whole thing is like, oh, that is so messed up. I would have to do that.
And it's worth noting. It's funny you mention that, because like I get accused when I play of playing weirdo characters as well. Because if I've got the option of playing something really fucked up, I will do that. But the reason I do that though is not because like, oh, I can't wait to like stomp over everyone else's shit. It's because a lot of times those weirdo concepts give you plenty of opportunities to interact with other characters and other players and help bring them out. Like, and I love, like, I mean, I knew that I wanted to play something weird in your campaign. All right, Emmy. Hey. All right. Yep. Fuck them for going on our lawn. How dare you get on our lawn? Fuck you. Fuck you.
Off my lawn.
But yeah, that's the thing that's funny. Is having that, because I think that from our perspective, right, it's not that, haha, I'll make his other DM's job harder. It's, haha, I'm handing you story shit to work with.
Oh yeah, and it's great because if I'm not playing the support character, I may not play up the weird shit aspect of this character all the time, but as soon as everything gets quiet, it's like, ooh, we've hit a lull. Now's the time to activate weird shit.
I mentioned before my disruptive player that I've got in my regular games, and it's great because that's what helps keep things going. If there's a lull while I'm waiting for the players to make up their fucking mind, he'll be like, what's this button do?
Exactly.
And not surprising, he's a DM as well too. So
Oh yeah, man, now I almost want to do a more scientific thing of like how many people do either a support character or a completely batshit crazy character when they normally GM all the time.
But you're right about the support thing too, because like you want to that's playing those characters that they're not the glory moment characters, right? They're the ones who do the heavy lifting, right?
Yeah, you do you, and I'll be here to do the stuff that needs to get done. Just do whatever crazy shit you want to do, and if you need healed, I'll do it. Or you need, whatever, I'm here.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, Jared, thank you so much for making time for this very, very long conversation about this. It really has helped me figure out. I'm looking forward to approaching the game again from a new perspective and trying to figure a way to at the very least, I'm getting it to the table another time again.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like you've had a lot of fun with the game.
Oh yeah, definitely. There is a lot of tools. I think the big sticking point is there's a lot of great tools and there's a great core there. There just needed to be like maybe one more layer of explaining how to use those tools.
Yeah. And with so many games on offer nowadays too, it's the things that get you excited. I've sort of decided to trim my games down to like, if it's a game that I really get excited about, that's what I'm going to run. And if it's a game that I'm ambivalent about, or I'm feeling like I'm doing it to satisfy my players or something like that, I'm probably not going to run it anymore.
Yeah.
So to get and go ahead.
And I definitely think that's the other component too, is as much as no matter how much you may love a game, if other people are not into it, don't force it.
Yeah.
I had the thing, I love Adventures in Middle Earth. And with my current group, they are so not into Tolkien at all. Like they're into D&D. And it's like, well, it's like D&D. And I even had a few people that were like, I would play it for you. And it's like, I don't want you to play it for me. If you're not excited about it, I don't want to play it. Because I'm going to be geeking out about stuff. And you're going to be like, yeah, that is a thing. And then it's going to suck all the energy out of that cycle. I need to throw this energy in here. And you throw energy back at me. And we keep it going.
That game is Ars Magica for me.
Yeah.
I will never find a group to play that one. Every time I've described it as an option, my players are like, no.
Yeah, that certainly is a game.
Yes, I agree with you that it's a game that could be played. It is not one I have any interest in playing. Oh, geez, cool. But yes, thank you so much.
No problem.
For anyone who, again, wants to see more of Jared, you can feel free to follow through the links in the description of the video to his YouTube channel, to Gnome Stew, where you can find some excellent, comprehensive, and thoughtful reviews of games that are more off the beaten path than just a latest Wizards release, and his blog, where he's got some great a lot of the same stuff that we've talked about now, where it's just passing ideas about gaming are there, and they're always thoughtful and well written. So.
And unfortunately, the blog's been a little bit more neglected since I've been doing the Gnome Stew reviews, because sometimes it just takes a lot of time to do those. But yeah, when I have a random thought, and also sometimes when I want to do a 5th edition review, I'll put it on my blog instead of Gnome Stew, just because it's like, this was a neat thing that's D&D related, and I don't necessarily want to shove it there, but it may end up there. Like I did a review of Kobold Press's Warlock zine that they're doing through Patreon on there, because it was just such a neat little product that I wanted to have some review there, but I didn't necessarily think it warranted a full-blown Gnome Stew version of the review. So
okay. So as always as well, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns regarding our conversation today, please don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section below, and I will, either myself or Jared or both of us, will respond. Otherwise, Jared, thank you so much again for making time for this. I know it's a long weekend.
I had such a great time when we had that game together. It's great to just be able to sit here and talk to you. So I apologize for anyone watching this that picked up on that whole, man, I haven't gamed with you for a while. Let's just go off on a tangent for the next half hour that has nothing to do with the topic.
But I will defend that, because it gave what the value there was it gave context to what the rest of understanding where you're coming from, what your experience is with gaming, and what your understanding of gaming was, prior to engaging 7th Sea. It's such a different, like you said at the conclusion, it's such a different animal from a lot of traditional role-playing games, that it does require that perspective, that you can come from that kind of background and still really find a lot to love about that game.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
cool. So until next time, folks, I hope you enjoyed this first foray behind the screen, and we will see you again soon. Thanks.